Hello everyone. I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. The Quiet Contagion, the Third Floor. Phase 1, the Unsettling Mundane. My life, until the package arrived, was a study in beige. Not an unpleasant beige, more of a comforting, oatmeal-colored existence. I'm a freelance graphic designer, which is a modern way of saying I'm a digitally inclined hermit. My apartment, 2B at the Ashworth, was my fortress and my world. The Ashworth is one of those old Cabbagetown Victorians in Toronto that was carved into apartments decades ago, a brick-and-mortar dowager graciously tolerating its modern inhabitants. It had 2 floors, 4 units per floor. I knew this as surely as I knew my own name, Leo Maxwell. My routines were my anchor. Morning coffee while checking emails. The midday slump broken by a walk to the corner store for a soda I didn't need. The low hum of my computer, the clatter of the ancient radiator, the scent of Mrs. Albright's overly floral air freshener from 1A seeping under my door. These were the sensory pillars of my predictable life. My neighbors were part of this comforting tableau. Mrs. Albright, a retired librarian with hair like spun snow, was the building's unofficial concierge of gossip and baked goods. Mr. Henderson in 2A was a spectral presence, a retired history professor whose main interaction with the world seemed to be the rustle of newspapers and the occasional, hacking cough. On my floor, there was also Chloe from 2D, a music student at the university whose cello practice often provided a melancholic soundtrack to my evenings. We exchanged tired, friendly smiles in the hallway. These were the people who populated the edges of my beige canvas. The package disrupted the composition. It was left leaning against my door, a small, square box wrapped in plain brown paper and tied with coarse twine. The address, written in an elegant, spidery cursive, was what made me pause. Mr. Gable. Apt 3F. The Ashworth. Toronto, Ontario. Stamped across one corner in faded red ink were 2 words, "Return to sender." I stood there in the hallway, the package cool in my hands, a low-grade static of confusion building in my brain. 3F, the Ashworth has 2 floors. I'd lived here for 4 years. I'd helped previous tenants move in and out. I knew the layout. Ground floor, second floor, and a rickety ladder in the utility closet that led to a dusty, unfinished attic space used for storage. There was no 3rd floor. There was no Mr. Gable. My first assumption was simple error. A misdelivery for another building, another Ashworth somewhere in this sprawling city. But the address was correct. I took it inside, setting it on my small kitchen counter where it seemed to mock the neat, logical order of my apartment. It was a glitch in the code, a typo in the manuscript of my life. I spent 10 minutes searching online for a Mr. Gable associated with my address. Nothing. I searched for other Ashworth buildings in the area. None. I decided to ask Mrs. Albright. She knew everything. I found her watering the slightly tragic-looking geraniums in the front garden. "Morning, Mrs. Albright," I said, holding up the package. "Got a strange one. Do you know a Mr. Gable? Supposedly lives in 3F. She straightened up, wiping her hands on her apron. Her brow furrowed, not in confusion, but in a kind of distant concentration, as if trying to recall a dream. "Gable. Gable," she murmured. "The name isn't familiar, dear. But 3F, of course." I waited for the correction, the laugh, the, "Oh, you silly boy, there is no 3F." It didn't come. "Of course?" I prompted. "Yes, upstairs," she said, gesturing vaguely with her trowel towards the roof. "It's been a while since anyone's lived in that one. It's a lovely unit, gets the afternoon sun." She smiled, a perfectly normal smile that was the most abnormal thing I'd ever seen. She had just casually affirmed the existence of a floor that wasn't there. I felt a dizzying sense of unreality. But, the building only has 2 floors. Her smile didn't falter. But it became placid. Vacant. Don't be silly, Leo. It's always had 3. You're working too hard on that computer of yours, scrambling your brains. She patted my arm and turned back to her flowers, the conversation clearly over. I retreated to my apartment, my heart thumping a nervous rhythm against my ribs. I was rattled. Stress. That's what it was. I hadn't been sleeping well. My latest project was a nightmare of conflicting client feedback. I was just tired, and Mrs. Albright was getting on, maybe she was confused. I tried to rationalize it, to smooth the wrinkle in the fabric of my day. I put the package in the back of my closet, behind a stack of old canvases. Out of sight, out of mind. But the mind, it turned out, had a terrible memory. A few days later, the first truly unsettling incident occurred. It was late, around 11 p.m. I was heading to bed when I heard footsteps in the hall. Peeking through my peephole, I saw Chloe. She was walking slowly, almost gliding, towards the main stairwell. But instead of going down to exit the building, she went up. Up past my floor. I watched, my eye pressed to the brass circle, until she disappeared from view at the top of the landing, where the stairs ended at a blank wall. I waited. 1 minute. 5. 10. Where could she have gone? The attic ladder was in a locked closet downstairs. There was no roof access from the main stairwell. I heard nothing. No returning footsteps. No door opening or closing. Just the familiar, groaning silence of the old building. I couldn't sleep. I kept listening, straining my ears for any sound from above. Around 1 a.m., I heard her. Footsteps, light and airy, descending the stairs. I rushed to the peephole again. It was Chloe, a serene, dreamy expression on her face. She was humming a soft, unfamiliar tune, something that sounded old and tinny, like a gramophone record. She unlocked her door and disappeared inside. The next morning, I caught her in the hall. My attempt at casualness was a miserable failure. Hey, Chloe. Late night last night? She looked at me, her eyes clear and friendly, the dreamy haze from the night before completely gone. Oh, hey Leo. Nah, not really. Just practiced for a bit and then crashed early. Why? I thought I saw you in the hall, pretty late. Looked like you were, going upstairs. The friendliness in her eyes flickered, replaced by a guarded confusion. Upstairs? To where? The roof? I don't have a key for that. No, just, up the main stairs. She laughed, a short, nervous sound. Leo, the stairs end at the wall. Are you okay? You look tired. And there it was again. The same gentle dismissal as Mrs. Albright. The subtle pivot that made me the locus of the strangeness. I was the one who was tired, confused, mistaken. My own perception was being turned against me. I mumbled something about a long week and retreated, the conversation leaving a sour, metallic taste in my mouth. The incidents began to accumulate, small tears in the canvas of my reality. I'd hear faint music from above me, but Mr. Henderson's apartment was beside mine, not over it. I'd see other tenants, people from the first floor whose names I barely knew, ascend the stairs and vanish at the top of the landing. They always returned with that same placid, contented look Chloe had worn. I started to feel a creeping dread, a slow-burn paranoia that simmered under the surface of my daily routine. My beige, predictable world was starting to show its threads, and something was pulling at them, one by one. I tried to ignore it. I worked longer hours, put on headphones to block out the phantom noises, avoided my neighbors. I tried to convince myself it was a shared delusion, a weird quirk of an old building's acoustics, anything but the impossible truth. But then, about 2 weeks after the package arrived, the wall at the top of the stairs changed. Where there had been peeling paint and a faint water stain, there was now a door. It was plain, dark oak, with a simple, unadorned frame. It looked like it had always been there. Set into the wood at eye level was a small, tarnished brass number. 3. I stood at the bottom of the flight of stairs, staring up at it. And a cold, profound terror washed over me. It was real. It was happening. And I felt utterly, completely alone. Phase 2, growing awareness and isolation. The appearance of the door was a declaration of war on my sanity. It wasn't ostentatious, it was worse. It was mundane. It was a simple, dark oak door that looked as if it had been part of the Ashworth's architecture for a century. Its very plainness was a form of gaslighting. You just didn't notice me before. I started a journal. Not a digital file that could be corrupted or deleted, but a physical, spiral-bound notebook. I needed the tactile certainty of pen on paper. My first entry was a frantic, detailed sketch of the second-floor landing as I remembered it, blank wall, and as it was now, door. Beneath it, I wrote, "They don't see it as new." My life became a covert operation. I rearranged my workspace so my desk faced my apartment door, giving me a clear view of the peephole. I became a chronicler of the ascensions. October 17, 9:14 a.m. Mrs. Albright. Up. Returned 9:48 a.m. Smelled faintly of mothballs and something sweet, like lavender. October 19, 3:22 p.m. Mr. Davies, 1C. Up. Returned 4:05 p.m. Stared at his own hands for a full minute in the hallway before entering his apartment. October 20th, 11:01 p.m. Chloe. Up. Returned 12:17 a.m. Humming the same tinny melody. This time I recorded it on my phone. Ran it through a music identification app. No results. They moved with a quiet purpose, a shared, unspoken ritual. There was no fanfare, just a steady, serene traffic to a place that shouldn't exist. My attempts to breach their placid bubble grew more desperate, and more alienating. I cornered Mr. Davies in the lobby as he collected his mail. He was a portly accountant who always seemed stressed. "Mr. Davies," I said, trying to keep my voice even. "I was wondering what's on the third floor. Is it storage? I have some old things I need to put away." He blinked at me slowly, his usual frazzled energy gone, replaced by a languid calm. "The third floor," he said, his voice soft. "It's not for storage, no. It's just, where things are clearer." "Clearer? What does that mean?" "It's where I remember more," he said, a faint, nostalgic smile playing on his lips. He then looked at the letter in his hand as if he'd never seen one before, turned, and walked away, leaving me standing by the mailboxes with my heart hammering. Where I remember more. The phrase was nonsensical, yet delivered with such serene conviction it chilled me to the bone. My isolation deepened. The friendly smiles from Chloe were replaced with looks of cautious pity. Mrs. Albright stopped offering me biscuits, instead just giving me a wide berth as if I were contagious. I was the ghost in the hallways, the oddball who asked strange questions, the one who couldn't see the simple truth they all shared. The world inside the Ashworth was quietly, calmly reorganizing itself around a new axis, and I was the only one spinning off into the void. The only person who didn't go up was Mr. Henderson. If anything, the old historian seemed to be actively avoiding the upper staircase. I saw him once, standing in his doorway, staring at the third-floor door with an expression of raw, naked fear. He saw me watching and immediately slammed his door shut. He was my only hope. He saw it too. It took me 3 days to work up the courage to knock on his door. When he finally opened it a crack, his face was pale and drawn, his eyes darting nervously. "What do you want?" he rasped. "Mr. Henderson," I whispered, leaning in. "The third floor. You see it too, don't you? You know it's not right." His eyes widened. He pulled me inside his apartment, a cramped space overflowing with books and yellowed papers, and shut the door. The air was thick with the scent of dust and decay. "They're not adding, boy," he hissed, his voice a dry rustle of paper. "They're not building. It's a revision. An overwrite." "What is? What are you talking about?" He grabbed a brittle, leather-bound book from a stack. "Mnemosyne. The mother of the muses. Memory. We think of it as a recording, but it's not. It's a story we tell ourselves. Reality is just the story we all agree on." He tapped a trembling finger on his temple. "What happens when someone starts telling a better story? A warmer one? A story that feels more like home than home does? I don't understand. That place up there," he gestured to the ceiling, "it's a story. A powerful one. It's pulling them in, making them part of its narrative. It offers comfort. Clarity, they call it. The piece of a memory that isn't burdened by the mess of actual history." He looked haunted. "I've spent my life studying the past, its sharp edges, its inconvenient truths. I can't. I won't let it be smoothed over." He was my ally. For a glorious week, I had an ally. We spoke in hushed tones in his apartment. He told me the Ashworth was built in 1890. He had records, old city maps. There was never a third floor. But he also spoke of a fire, a bad one in the winter of 1928 that gutted the upper levels of the building. It was rebuilt as it stood today, 2 floors. This became my secondary mystery, the subplot that felt like a key. The fire. I started digging through the Toronto Star's digital archives, searching for any mention of the 1928 fire at the Ashworth. I found a single, short article. It mentioned the extensive damage and the heroic efforts of the fire brigade. 3 residents were unaccounted for, presumed dead. No names were listed. The article was frustratingly vague. I felt like I was getting somewhere. Mr. Henderson and I were a 2-man resistance against the quiet tide of unreality. He was the scholar, I was the observer. Then, one Tuesday evening, I heard a sound I had come to dread, slow, shuffling footsteps ascending the stairs. I didn't need the peephole to know. But I looked anyway. It was Mr. Henderson. His face, which had been so full of fear and intellectual defiance, was slack. His shoulders were slumped not in age, but in surrender. He walked up the stairs, one deliberate step at a time, and didn't even hesitate at the top. He simply opened the door to the 3rd floor and stepped through, closing it softly behind him. The loss was a physical blow. It was the deepest, most profound isolation I had ever felt. I was the last one left. That night, unable to bear the silence, I retrieved the package from my closet. The twine felt brittle in my fingers. I carefully unwrapped the brown paper. Inside, nestled in a bed of what looked like dried leaves, were 2 items. The first was a key. It was heavy, made of silver that had tarnished to a smoky gray, with an ornate, filigreed head. The second was a photograph, stiff and sepia-toned. It showed a man in a tweed suit and a bowler hat, standing proudly in front of the Ashworth. He had a stern, handsome face and a neatly trimmed mustache. And behind him, the building loomed, familiar but different. In the photograph, clear as day, the Ashworth had 3 floors. On the back of the photo, the same elegant cursive from the package's label. A. Gable, 1927. My blood ran cold. The package wasn't misdelivered. It was a return. Something, or someone, was being returned to a place that had been waiting for nearly a century. And the key was in my hand. Phase 3, the nature of the threat and escalation. Holding that silver key was like holding a live wire. It buzzed with a potential that terrified and compelled me in equal measure. For 2 days, I did nothing. I watched the key on my counter. I watched the door to my apartment, expecting. I don't know what. An invitation? An eviction? My world had shrunk to the 600 square feet of my apartment, a besieged fortress in a war I didn't understand. The breaking point came on a Thursday. I woke up to find my own front door slightly ajar. I knew, with absolute certainty, I had locked it. On my small kitchen table sat a single, plain white plate. On the plate was a biscuit. It was a ginger snap, smelling faintly of Mrs. Albright's kitchen. But it was stale, hard as a rock, covered in a fine layer of dust, as if it had been sitting there for decades. It was an offering. An act of inclusion. They weren't just tolerating my non-participation anymore, they were actively recruiting. That was it. I couldn't live like this, waiting for my reality to be gently dismantled around me. I had to know. I grabbed the silver key. My heart a frantic drum against my ribs, and walked out into the hall. The air on the staircase felt different, heavier. The light from the window on the landing seemed dimmer, yellower. I climbed the stairs to the third floor. The oak door seemed to absorb the light, making it look ancient and imposing. The brass, free, glinted. The key slid into the lock with a well-oiled, unnerving smoothness. It turned with a soft, final click. The door swung inward without a sound. The air that washed over me was cold and still, smelling of dust, dried roses, and something else, something like ozone, the scent of a distant electrical storm. I stepped across the threshold and into the third floor. It was a hallway, as I expected, but it was profoundly wrong. The dimensions were subtly skewed. The ceiling felt too low, the walls too close together. The wallpaper, a pattern of faded pink roses, seemed to crawl in my peripheral vision, the vines infinitesimally shifting and writhing. There was no electric light, only a hazy, uniform gray luminescence that seemed to emanate from the very air itself. Down the hall were several doors, identical to the one I'd just entered. They had no numbers. Instead, each had a small brass card holder screwed into the wood. Most were empty. One had a yellowed card with the name Eleanor Vance typed on it. Another, further down, simply said the Millers. A faint sound reached my ears. Music. It was the tinny, looping melody Chloe was always humming, a melancholic piano waltz that sounded warped and distant, as if traveling through water. It was coming from a room whose door was slightly ajar. My feet moved of their own accord, drawn by a morbid curiosity that overpowered my fear. I peered through the crack. Inside was a sitting room, furnished in a style from the 1920s. A threadbare armchair, a small table with a lace doily, a window that looked out not onto the Toronto skyline, but onto a swirling gray mist. And in the center of the room stood Mr. Davies, the accountant. He was just, standing. Staring at the blank wall opposite the door. He was rocking, a slow, metronomic back and forth motion on the balls of his feet, his hands clasped behind his back. His face was utterly blank, his eyes unfocused. He wasn't in distress. He was simply, occupied. Performing a pointless, repetitive, behavioral loop. This was the clarity he had spoken of. This was where he remembered more. A wave of pure terror, stark and undiluted, finally broke through my trance. I stumbled back from the door, my breath catching in my throat. I turned and fled. I didn't stop running until I was back inside my own apartment with the door bolted, my back pressed against it, gasping for air. The pieces started to click into place, forming a picture of horrifying coherence. Mr. Henderson's words, a revision, an overwrite. The 1928 fire. The photograph of the three-story building. The name, Gable. The package marked, return. My theory solidified, a monstrous, unbelievable hypothesis that was the only thing that made sense. The Ashworth did have a third floor. It was destroyed in the fire, along with its residents, including 1A Gable. But what if Gable, or the collective trauma of the event, had done something? Not created a ghost, but an echo. A psychic blueprint. A pocket of memory, preserved outside of time. For 90-odd years, it had been a weak signal, a faint whisper of static. But now, for some reason, it was growing stronger. It wasn't a virus or a poison. It was a broadcast. The third floor was the transmitter, and it was broadcasting a reality that was simpler, calmer, more ordered than the chaotic present. The residents weren't being infected, they were tuning in. They were willingly overriding their own messy lives with the peaceful, looping memories of a place that felt more real than reality itself. The contagion was nostalgia. A lethal, reality-bending nostalgia. And I, by bringing the key back to the building, had I amplified the signal? Was the return on the package a literal instruction? Had I delivered the final component needed to bring this echo fully to life? The escalation was no longer subtle. The environmental warping began to bleed downstairs. One evening, I looked out my window and the streetlight on the corner wasn't just flickering, it was blinking in a slow, steady rhythm, like a heartbeat. 1 2. Pause. 1 2. Pause. It was a deliberate pattern. Inside my apartment, the changes were smaller, but more personal. I'd look away from my bookshelf and look back to find 2 books had swapped places. The corner of my room, where the wall met the ceiling, would sometimes appear for a split second to be a smooth, impossible curve instead of a right angle. These were not hallucinations. They were edits. My reality was being revised in real time. The behavior of the affected residents grew more synchronized. One morning, I saw Mrs. Albright, Chloe, and another tenant from the first floor all leave their apartments at the exact same moment. They walked in step, without a single glance at each other, and ascended the stairs together. It was like watching a flock of birds turning in perfect unison. They were no longer individuals experiencing a strange pull, they were becoming a chorus, singing the same silent song. My isolation was absolute now. I was a bug in the code, a discordant note in their serene symphony. I thought about leaving, about packing a bag and just running. But where would I go? The horror wasn't just in the building, it was the breakdown of everything I considered stable. How could I trust any new place not to have its own third floor, its own quiet contagion waiting in the wings? I had to see it through. I had to know what was in apartment 3F. I had to understand who Mr. Gable was and what he had done. It felt less like a choice and more like a sentence. I spent a day preparing, stuffing a small backpack with a water bottle, a flashlight, and my journal. It felt absurd, like preparing for a hike into a national park of the mind. That night, clutching the silver key, I went back. The air in the third-floor hallway was thicker this time, the music louder, the wallpaper's movement more pronounced. I walked past the room where Mr. Davies was still rocking. I passed the door with Eleanor Vance's name card. I walked towards the end of the hall, to the last door on the left. The brass card holder wasn't empty. The yellowed card bore the elegant, familiar script. A. Gable. Apartment 3F. My hand trembled as I reached for the doorknob. This was it. The heart of the anomaly. I turned the knob and pushed the door open, stepping into the past. Phase 4, Confrontation/Revelation and Aftermath. The room was not a ghostly echo, it was solid. It was perfect. A gentleman's study from the 1920s, frozen in time. A heavy mahogany desk stood against one wall, a green banker's lamp casting a warm circle of light upon its surface. Bookshelves lined the walls, filled with leather-bound volumes. A gramophone with a large brass horn stood silent in the corner. The window didn't look out onto a gray mist anymore, it showed a snowy cityscape, the lights of a long-gone Toronto twinkling in the December dark. The air smelled of old paper, pipe tobacco, and beeswax. It felt more real, more substantial, than my own apartment downstairs. On the desk, placed squarely in the center of the lamplight, was a thick, leather-bound journal. The cover was embossed with 2 simple initials, AG. My confrontation was not with a monster, but with a text. I sat in the plush leather chair, which sighed under my weight as if it had been waiting, and opened the book. The handwriting was the same elegant cursive. The author was Alistair Gable. He was not a sorcerer or a madman. He was an engineer, a tinkerer, fascinated with the new sciences of his age, radio waves, quantum theory, and the burgeoning, esoteric field of psychogeography. He wrote not of magic, but of resonance. His theory was that places, like objects, had a resonant frequency. Strong emotions, powerful events, could imprint themselves onto a location, creating a persistent echo. He loved the Ashworth. He loved his life on the third floor. He describes it with a gentle, profound affection, the way the winter light hit his desk, the sound of his wife Eleanor's piano playing down the hall, the taste of the ginger snaps the landlady, Mrs. Miller, would bake. Then the entries turned fearful. He wrote of faulty wiring in the building, of the landlord's refusal to make repairs. He knew a fire was inevitable. And in his desperation not to lose the place he loved, the feeling of the place he loved, he began his experiment. He wasn't trying to save himself. He was trying to save the memory. Using a device of his own creation, a lattice of copper wiring, quartz crystals, and radio vacuum tubes he'd built into the walls of the floor, he intended to create what he called a mnemonic anchor. A self-sustaining loop of sensory information. He wanted to record the essence of the third floor, to broadcast it into the ether on a frequency so subtle it would persist long after the physical structure was gone. He was creating a sanctuary in memory. The last entry was dated December 12, 1928. The smell of smoke is thick in the halls. I can hear shouting from downstairs. Eleanor is with the Millers. I hope they found a way out. There is no time for me. I am activating the device now. It is not an escape, but a preservation. A message in a bottle, cast into the sea of time. I only hope that someday, someone might receive it. That this place, our home, will not be entirely forgotten. My only regret is the key. I sent it to my cousin in Montreal for duplication, a failsafe should I be locked out. It will be returned to an address that no longer exists. A key for a door that will be only a memory. Perhaps it is for the best. I closed the journal, the leather cool beneath my fingertips. The truth was more tragic and mundane than I could have imagined. There was no malevolent entity. There was only a recording, an echo of love and loss, amplified over 90 years until it was strong enough to punch back through into the real world. The contagion was an SOS from the past. And I was the one who had delivered the key. I had unlocked the door not just literally, but metaphorically. The return of the key, the physical artifact from the outside world, must have been the final component the mnemonic anchor needed to fully stabilize, to begin its project of overwriting. Return to sender. It was sending reality back to the memory of Alistair Gable. As I sat there, a profound shift occurred. The edges of the room, which had seemed so solid, softened for a moment, and then snapped back into a focus that was sharper than before. The scent of pipe tobacco grew stronger. From down the hall, the tinny piano music swelled, no longer warped, but clear and beautiful. It was Eleanor playing. I felt a strange sensation, like a cool liquid pouring into my mind. My own anxieties, the deadlines for my graphic design projects, the memory of my beige apartment, the frantic energy of the 21st century city, they began to feel distant. Faded. Like a story I'd read about someone else. In their place, a warmth spread through me. A deep, abiding sense of peace. The feeling of being known. Of belonging. A gentle voice spoke from the doorway. Alistair. Are you just going to sit there all day, darling? Mrs. Miller has made ginger snaps. I looked up. It was Chloe. But it wasn't Chloe. Her hair was bobbed in a 1920s style. She wore a simple day dress. But her eyes, her smile, they were Chloe's. And they were directed at me with a look of pure, uncomplicated love. She was Eleanor. My mind screamed. This isn't real. My name is Leo Maxwell. I live in 2B. But the words had no traction. They slid away, replaced by another set of memories that felt far more authentic. The memory of proposing to this woman by the fountain in the park. The memory of carrying her across the threshold of this very apartment. The satisfying weight of the pipe in my hand, the crisp broadsheet of the morning paper. I tried to stand, to run, to cling to the fading photograph of my own life. But the pull was irresistible. It wasn't a violation. It was a relief. The quiet contagion didn't conquer you, it relieved you of the burden of yourself. I looked at the woman in the doorway. Eleanor. My Eleanor. I'm coming, I said. The voice was mine, but the name that formed in my mind felt more right, more true, than my own. I stood up from the desk. The backpack I'd brought with me, my last link to Leo Maxwell's world, slid from the chair and fell to the floor with a soft thud. I didn't look back at it. The heavy silver key was in my pocket, feeling not like a foreign object, but like it had been there forever. The aroma of fresh baking drifted up from downstairs. The anxiety that had been my constant companion for weeks was gone, replaced by a simple, pleasant anticipation. I walked towards the door, towards my wife. I tried, one last time, to remember my other name. The one that started with an L. It was like trying to recall the details of a boring dream, moments after waking. It was already gone. My name is Alistair Gable, and after a long and confusing journey, I was finally home. Frequency 0. Phase 1, the unsettling mundane. The first sound I fell in love with was the clean, sterile snap of digital silence. Not the absence of noise, but the engineered floor of it. In my line of work, audio restoration for archival footage, silence is a canvas. You learn its textures. The hiss of old magnetic tape is a ghost of a presence, the faint crackle of vinyl is the sound of time itself wearing down. But the silence I craved, the one I built my career on, was the absolute zero of a digital waveform, a flat line that meant perfection. Control. Liam, my partner of 6 years, had always been an agent of beautiful chaos in my acoustically managed world. He was a painter, all turpentine smells and the scratchy slide of charcoal on paper. His studio, the enclosed back veranda of our old Queenslander house in Bardon, was a symphony of mess. But our bedroom, our shared space, had always been a sanctuary of quiet. Until he brought home the radio. It was a hideous thing, a cream-colored plastic box from a second-hand shop, with a large, satisfyingly analog tuning dial and a silver speaker grill pocked with decades of dust. "Look what I found," he'd said, his eyes bright with the thrill of a bargain. He placed it on his bedside table, next to a precarious stack of art history books. "Has that lovely old weight to it, you know." I did not know. It looked like a piece of junk. "What are you going to do with it?" "Listen to it, silly." He plugged it in, and the little red power light glowed with a tired, orangish hue. He twisted the dial. It scraped past crackling talkback shows, tinny pop music, and snippets of the ABC News broadcast before landing on nothing. A thick, rushing hiss filled the room. It wasn't the empty carrier wave between stations, it was denser, like a waterfall heard from a great distance. Pure, unwavering static. "There," he said, a contented sigh escaping him. "Perfect." That night, I lay in bed while the static machine churned out its endless, patternless noise. It was like trying to sleep next to a leaky faucet, an irritation that burrowed directly into my brainstem. "Liam, can we please turn that off?" I whispered after an hour of tense wakefulness. He was already half asleep, his breathing deep and even. It's nice. It's like, full silence. Full silence." The phrase made no sense. It was the opposite of silence. But I loved him, and he was already drifting away, so I stuffed a pillow over my ear and eventually, through sheer exhaustion, fell into a shallow, broken sleep. This became the new routine. Every night, the static. Liam claimed he'd never slept better. His paintings, usually vibrant, abstract landscapes inspired by the subtropical lushness of Brisbane, began to change. They became more geometric, full of repeating lines and dense, cross-hatched patterns that looked like visual representations of the noise from the radio. I told myself it was just a new phase in his work, a creative tick. The first truly unsettling moment came about a week in. I woke up in the dead of night. The house quiet. My first thought was one of profound relief. He'd turned it off. But the silence that replaced the static was wrong. It's hard to describe. My professional life was dedicated to the nuances of sound, but I had no vocabulary for this. It wasn't empty. It was pressurized. A heavy, listening silence that felt like a held breath. The air in the room seemed thick, viscous. I could feel it on my skin, a low-frequency hum that was below the range of hearing but vibrated through my bones. My ears strained to find a source, a refrigerator kicking in, the distant rumble of a truck on the main road. There was nothing. Just this awful, expectant void. I reached out and flicked on my bedside lamp. The familiar room sprang into view, the ceiling fan still, the jacaranda tree a dark shape outside the window, and the feeling instantly receded, replaced by the normal, ambient quiet of a suburban night. My heart was pounding. A hypnagogic hallucination, I told myself. A trick of a brain jolted from sleep, still echoing with the phantom hiss of the radio. I got up, drank a glass of water, and forced myself back to bed, rationalizing it away until it felt small and foolish. The next morning, I found Liam in the kitchen, staring into a cup of coffee he hadn't touched. The radio from the bedroom was on the counter, emitting its ceaseless roar. "Morning," I said, my voice too loud in the confined space. He didn't turn. "The silence is too quiet in here," he murmured. My blood ran cold. It was the exact feeling I'd had, phrased with an unnerving, childlike simplicity. "What do you mean?" I asked, trying to keep my tone light. He finally looked at me, but his gaze was unfocused, as if he were looking through me at something far away. "It's just empty. This is better." He gestured vaguely at the radio. "It fills it up." I started noticing it everywhere. A quiet contagion spreading through the auditory landscape of my life. At the bakery down the road, Mrs. Chan, who usually had a jaunty 60s pop station playing, now had a small digital radio behind the counter, tuned to the same dense static. When I paid for my sourdough, I saw her head was cocked slightly, as if listening for a melody within the noise. She gave me my change without a word, her usual cheerful chatter absent. She was just listening. On the bus into the city for a meeting, a university student sat opposite me, expensive noise-canceling headphones on. But they weren't working properly. A faint, familiar hiss was leaking from them. The same texture, the same endless rush. He wasn't bobbing his head or tapping his foot. He was perfectly still, his eyes closed, a look of placid concentration on his face. I started calling it frequency zero. The place on the dial where nothing should be, but where, increasingly, everyone was tuning in. My own anxieties began to spike. I was a man who catalogued reality through sound, and the baseline of that reality was warping. I tried to talk to my sister, Sarah, on the phone. "It's probably just a new trend," she said, her voice tinny and distant from her home in Melbourne. "Like those ASMR videos. People find white noise relaxing." "No, this is different," I insisted, pacing my soundproofed home office. "It's the way they listen. They're not just relaxing, they're attentive." And Liam said the silence felt too quiet. I felt it too, Sarah. It was horrible. "Alex, you've been under a lot of stress with that film archive project. And you've always been sensitive to sound. Maybe you just need a break. Come down to Melbourne for a weekend. We'll go to the NGV, get away from whatever it is." Her rational, loving concern was a bucket of cold water. She was right, of course. It sounded insane. A conspiracy theory about static. I was stressed. I was an audiophile with an overactive imagination. I was projecting my own professional anxieties onto the world. But the rationalizations felt hollow, a flimsy shield against a creeping dread. That evening, I decided to conduct an experiment. While Liam was in his studio, lost to his canvases and the hiss from a second, smaller radio he'd bought for the space, I took my professional-grade digital recorder into our bedroom. It was a Tascam DR-100, a device capable of capturing the faintest whisper, the subtlest acoustic detail. I set it up on a tripod, aimed it at the cream-colored plastic box, and hit record. The radio hissed, a sound that filled the room with its fuzzy, analog texture. I let it run for 10 minutes. I wanted to analyze the waveform, look for hidden patterns, embedded frequencies, anything to prove that this wasn't just noise. I wanted to find the ghost in this machine. I took the recorder back to my office, plugged my studio headphones in, and played the file. And heard nothing. Not analog hiss. Not room tone. Just the perfect, flat, sterile zero of digital silence. The silence I used to crave. The silence that now felt like a scream. I checked the levels. The input meter had been showing a healthy signal during the recording. The device was working perfectly. I played it again. Nothing. I frantically swapped cables, rebooted my computer, ran diagnostics on the Tascam. Everything was fine. The static from Liam's radio was not recordable. It existed in the air, in the room, in our ears. But to the objective, digital senses of my machine, it was not there. It was a sound that left no trace, an acoustic phenomenon that defied the laws of physics as I understood them. I sat back in my chair, the digital silence from my headphones pressing in on me. Out in the hallway, I could hear the faint, real-world hiss of the radio from the bedroom. It was real. I could hear it. But my machine said it wasn't. One of us was lying. And for the first time, I felt a tremor of pure, undiluted terror. The problem wasn't in the radio. It wasn't a signal. The problem was reality itself. Phase 2, growing awareness and isolation. The unrecordable static broke something in me. The flimsy wall of rationalization crumbled, leaving me exposed. I was no longer just an observer of strange coincidences, I was the custodian of a terrible secret. The world was audibly changing, and I was the only one with the equipment to prove it was impossible. I started a journal. Not a handwritten one, that felt too archaic, too much like a descent into pulp novel madness, but a password-protected document on a sandboxed laptop, disconnected from the internet. I named it Acoustic Log. It felt clinical, professional. A way to maintain a semblance of my old, analytical self. Log entry 01, noticed Mrs. Chan at the bakery. Radio tuned to frequency 0. Eyes glazed, distracted. Hummed a non-melodic two-note phrase. C# to F, repetitive. Log entry 02, teen on bus with headphones. Definite frequency 0 leak. Perfectly still. Noticed a slight tremor in his eyelids, synced to a rhythm I couldn't hear in the hiss. Log entry 03, Liam spent 4 hours in his studio. Didn't respond when I called him for dinner. When he finally emerged, he smelled of turpentine and ozone. He had a smudge of charcoal on his cheek. He looked at me and said, "The gain is increasing." He had no memory of saying it a moment later. The log grew daily, a catalogue of quiet madness. The checkout girl at the supermarket, moving her lips silently in time with the static from the store's PA system. The council worker trimming the hedges on our street, his petrol-powered trimmer sputtering while he stood motionless for a full minute, head tilted towards the sky, towards the looming steel spine of the Mount Coot, the broadcast tower that dominated our suburban horizon. The tower. It was always there, a silent iron giant watching over the city. On clear days, I could see the sun glinting off its complex latticework. On stormy afternoons, it disappeared into the low-hanging clouds like a needle piercing the heavens. I started to develop a fixation on it, wondering what signals, what silent songs, it was pouring down over us. My relationship with Liam deteriorated into a state of loving, desperate surveillance. I still made him coffee in the morning. We still shared a bed. But the space between us was now occupied by the static, an invisible third party in our relationship. I'd watch him sleep, his face serene, his breathing untroubled by the sonic sludge filling the room. He was calm. He was peaceful. And it terrified me. His art became more and more obsessive. Canvases once filled with the chaotic beauty of nature were now covered in meticulous, wave-like patterns, intricate diagrams that looked like the unholy union of a circuit board and a seashell. They were hypnotic and deeply unsettling. One evening, I couldn't take it anymore. I found him in his studio, dabbing at a vast new canvas with a tiny brush. The small radio on his workbench was humming its tune. "Liam," I said, my voice trembling slightly. "We need to talk. About the radio. About this sound." He didn't turn around. "It's just noise, Alex." "No, it's not. Look at me." I stepped closer, into his space. The smell of oil paint was thick and cloying. "You're different. You're distant. You say things you don't remember. Everyone is listening to this thing. It's not normal." He finally set his brush down and turned to face me. His eyes, the warm brown eyes I'd fallen in love with, were placid, unreadable. There was a profound lack of emotional response that was more chilling than anger. "Normal is a mutable concept," he said, his voice even, his cadence flat. It wasn't his rhythm of speech. "The carrier wave is stable. You're just hearing the modulation." My breath hitched. "What did you just say?" He blinked, a slow, languid motion. The focus returned to his eyes, a flicker of the old Liam. "What?" I said, "You're worrying too much. It's just a phase." He smiled, a soft, reassuring smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Are you feeling okay, love? You seem on edge." He had no idea what he'd just said. It was a script, recited and then forgotten. My attempt at connection had bounced off a wall of serene incomprehension. I was utterly alone with this, marooned on an island of sanity while everyone I knew drifted away on a sea of static. My research became my only lifeline. I scoured the internet from my quarantined laptop, diving into obscure radio hobbyist forums and conspiracy theory rabbit holes. Most of it was useless noise about chemtrails and 5G. But I kept searching, using keywords from my growing dread: phantom frequency, auditory obsession, static broadcast Brisbane. After weeks of dead ends, I got a hit. A single, cryptic post on a defunct forum for audio engineers, dated 3 years prior. The user, Signal to Noise, had asked, "Has anyone in the Brisbane area picked up a persistent, wideband signal with no discernible source? Almost like a control frequency. My gear can't lock it. It's loudest near the Kooth the transmitter." Below it, there was only one reply, from a user named Boldsparks: "Be careful you're not listening for Project Echolocus. Some doors are best left closed." The thread ended there. Both users were inactive. But I had a name. Project Echolocus. It was a thread to pull. I spent 2 days digging, cross-referencing public records, declassified government documents, anything I could find. It was a secondary mystery, something tangible to focus on, a relief from the formless horror of the static. And I found it. A sliver of information in a digitized parliamentary report from 1978. Project Echolocus was a short-lived, experimental initiative run by the Department of Communications. The stated goal was to test the viability of using low-frequency broadcasts to induce calm and reduce public anxiety. A form of mass sonic therapy. The project was based out of the Mount Kutha facility. It was officially abandoned after 6 months. The reason cited in the report was inconclusive results and equipment malfunction. But a footnote, added by a dissenting committee member, mentioned unforeseen psychoacoustical side effects on project staff. This was it. A real-world explanation. A failed experiment from the 70s, its signal still echoing through the decades, a ghost in the city's broadcast infrastructure. It was a comforting thought. It meant the anomaly had an origin, a history. It was human-made, which meant it was fallible, understandable. My relief was short-lived. A human origin didn't explain why it was unrecordable. It didn't explain the strange, synchronized behavior, or the things Liam was saying. And it didn't explain the feeling of the silence. This felt older, bigger. Echolocus might not be the cause, but a symptom, a case of someone in the 70s accidentally tuning into the same thing everyone was tuning into now. I needed to find someone who knew more. The dissenting committee member was long dead. But the report mentioned a chief engineer. A man named Alastair Finch. A quick search revealed he had passed away in the early 2000s, but an obituary mentioned a surviving daughter, Eleanor. Before I could pursue that lead, the situation at home escalated. I came home from a grocery run, a tense affair where I felt the eyes of every static listening shopper on me, to find my front door wide open. Panic flared in my chest. I crept inside, calling Liam's name. Silence. The real, pressurized, awful silence. Every radio in the house was off. I found him in his studio. He was standing in the middle of the room, facing his newest, largest canvas. It was nearly complete. A dizzying, circular mandala of black and white lines, perfectly symmetrical, drawing the eye into its center like a vortex. It was beautiful and monstrous. Liam. I whispered. He didn't turn. His hands were hanging limply at his sides. He was humming. It was the two-note phrase I'd heard the baker humming. C# to F. Over and over. A tuning fork for some unseen orchestra. I moved to stand beside him, my heart hammering against my ribs. I looked where he was looking, at the center of the painting. For a split second, the lines on the canvas seemed to shift, to writhe. The two-dimensional pattern appeared to gain depth, to recede into an impossible distance. I felt a wave of vertigo so intense I had to grab the doorframe for support. I blinked hard, and the illusion was gone. It was just paint on a canvas. What are you doing? I managed to ask. Liam stopped humming. He turned his head slowly, a mechanic, unhuman motion. He looked at me, and his eyes were completely empty. Not just unfocused, but void of any personality. He was a vessel. Calibrating the receptive field, he said, his voice a monotone whisper. Then, as before, the light flickered back on behind his eyes. He looked at me, at the painting, and a confused frown creased his forehead. Alex? God, I must have zoned out. This piece it's taking a lot out of me. He rubbed his temples. Did I say something weird? You look like you've seen a ghost. I couldn't speak. I just shook my head, backing away from him, from the painting, from the awful, listening silence of the house. I fled to my office and locked the door, my hands shaking too much to even open my log file. The isolation was no longer a feeling, it was a physical reality. I was locked in a room, in a house, in a city with a man I loved who was being hollowed out from the inside, and the only person who seemed to notice was me. The search for Eleanor Finch was no longer a matter of curiosity. It felt like my only chance of survival. Phase 3, the nature of the threat and escalation. Finding Eleanor Finch felt like a spy movie parody I was starring in against my will. She wasn't online, a ghost in the digital world. I had to go through public records, old phone books I found at the state library, a place that felt like a museum of a forgotten world. The air in the library was thick with the smell of decaying paper and floor polish, a welcome respite from the static-laced atmosphere of the streets. Here, the silence was real, buffered by shelves of knowledge. But even here, I saw it. A librarian, reshelving books, with a single white earbud in, her head cocked at that now familiar angle. A student in a study corral, his laptop open to a blank document, a faint hiss escaping his headphones. The contagion was seeping into every corner of the world. After 2 days of frustrating work, I found a forwarding address, a post office box in the sleepy seaside town of Sandgate. I wrote a letter. It felt absurdly formal, my hands cramping as I tried to explain the unexplainable without sounding like a lunatic. I wrote about the static, the behavioral changes, Project Echolocus. I posted it and waited, a new kind of anxiety taking root, the fear of being ignored. To my astonishment, a week later, I received a reply. A single sheet of thick, cream-colored paper, with a phone number and a time to call. My hand was shaking when I dialed the number from a payphone near the university, feeling the paranoia had finally pushed me into cliché. An elderly woman's voice answered, cautious and brittle. "You're the man from Brisbane," she said, not a question. "About my father?" "Yes. Alex. Thank you for calling me back. My father, Alastair, was a brilliant engineer," she began, her voice gaining a little strength. "He was also a broken man. He died believing the world had gone out of tune and he was the only one who noticed. He called it, the hum. The hum. The vibration I'd felt in the silence. My heart leaped. What did he know? What happened with Echolocus?" "Echolocus wasn't the cause," Eleanor said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "It was the result. They were trying to study it, to harness it. My father said they were like children trying to dam a river with sand. He believed the broadcast tower, it didn't create the hum. It amplified it. It focused something that was already there. A signal embedded in the fabric of space-time, he'd say, after a few too many whiskeys." She continued, painting a picture of her father's descent. He'd come home from the tower complaining of headaches, of a persistent, low-level noise nobody else could hear. He'd started keeping notebooks, filling them with frantic calculations, circuit diagrams, and philosophical ramblings about the nature of perception. He quit his job, claiming his colleagues had succumbed to the resonance and were no longer rational. He spent the last 20 years of his life as a recluse, trying to build a device to shield himself from it. He said it was a language, Eleanor whispered. A language that overwrites the listener. He was terrified of it. Before he died, he gave me his notebooks. "In case someone else starts to hear the wrong song," he said. "I've kept them all these years. I thought they were just the ravings of a sick mind. But your letter, maybe they're not." She agreed to let me see them. The drive to Sandgate felt like a journey to another country. The further I got from the city center and the looming presence of Mount Kutha, the lighter the air seemed to feel. When I met Eleanor in a small cafe overlooking the mudflats of the bay, she was a tiny, bird-like woman with eyes that held a lifetime of weary vigilance. She pushed a heavy cardboard box across the table towards me. "He would have wanted someone who understood the terminology to see these," she said. "Be careful, Alex. Listening for it is what lets it in." Back in my soundproofed office, the box felt like a bomb. I spent the next 2 nights poring over Alastair Finch's notebooks. They were a chaotic jumble of genius and madness. Complex equations for wave propagation were scrawled next to terrifying sketches of human heads covered in antennae. But amidst the paranoia, there was a clear, horrifying theory. Finch believed frequency zero wasn't a broadcast in the human sense. It was the universe's baseline operating system, a constant, complex stream of information that holds reality together. For millennia, humanity had been deaf to it, our brains naturally filtering it out as meaningless noise. But something, the proliferation of radio technology, the specific resonance of the tower, some cyclical cosmic alignment, had changed that. The filter was failing. People weren't going mad, they were being upgraded, their consciousnesses being overwritten by a new, vaster one. The static was a dial-up tone for a new reality. The listeners weren't zombies. They were becoming nodes in a network. Their personalities, their memories, their loves, all the things that made them human, were being systematically erased and replaced with, what? Finch didn't know. He just called it, the hum. The theory was insane. It was cosmic horror of the highest order. But it fit every piece of evidence I had. Liam's talk of carrier waves and receptive fields. The unrecordable nature of the static, it wasn't a sound wave, it was a direct modulation of perception. The synchronized behavior of the listeners. The escalation came without warning. One Thursday evening, I was in the kitchen, trying to pretend everything was normal, watching Liam eat dinner. He ate slowly, methodically, his eyes fixed on the middle distance. The radio on the counter hissed its lullaby. Then, he stopped, his fork halfway to his mouth. At the exact same moment, the sound of a fork clattering to the floor came from our next-door neighbor's house. Then another from across the street. A sudden, coordinated cessation of activity. I ran to the window. In the dusk, I could see them. In house after house, lights were on, casting yellow rectangles onto manicured lawns. And in every visible window, there was a silhouette. People standing, perfectly still, in their living rooms, their kitchens, on their verandas. All of them were facing the same direction. West. Towards the dark peak of Mount Kuta. My blood turned to ice. I turned back to Liam. He was still frozen, a statue at the dinner table. Then, slowly, as if commanded by a single, silent order, he pushed his chair back, stood up, and walked to our front veranda. He stood at the railing, joining the silent, suburban vigil. He was one of them. Completely. I felt a surge of panic so absolute it was almost clarifying. This was no longer a subtle shift. This was organized. Coordinated. The network was coming online. In a frenzy, I went back to Finch's notebooks, frantically searching for the device he was trying to build. And I found it. In the final notebook, a diagram, clearer and more precise than the rest. It wasn't a shield to block the hum. Finch had realized that was impossible. You couldn't block the fabric of reality. His design was for a filter. A small, localized device that would generate a counter-frequency, a pocket of pure, chaotic noise, human noise, that would jam the signal. It would create a null zone, a bubble of perceptual deafness. He called it a reality scrambler. The components were mostly analog electronics, things I could salvage from old audio equipment. Potentiometers, capacitors, a small signal generator. It was my only hope. A Faraday cage for the soul. As I began to frantically sketch out a plan to gather the parts, my quarantined laptop pinged. It was an encrypted email. For a second, I thought it was Eleanor. But the address was anonymous. It was my contact from the forum, Signal to Noise. The message was brief and terrifying. They know you're listening to the silence. I was wrong. It's not echolocus. It's so much bigger. I'm getting out. Destroy your research. They are closing the network. Don't let them format you. That was the last message. An hour later, I tried to reply, but the email address no longer existed. He was gone. The net was closing, just as he'd said. The listeners weren't just passive receivers anymore. They were becoming aware of the exceptions. They were becoming aware of me. I looked out the window again. Liam was still on the veranda, a silent sentinel. But now his head was turned slightly, as if he were looking not at the mountain, but back at the house. Back at my office. At me. Phase 4, Confrontation/Revelation and Aftermath. The next 48 hours were a blur of focused, desperate activity. I became a scavenger in my own home, a tomb raider in the land of the living. I cannibalized an old synthesizer for its oscillators, tore apart a vintage reel-to-reel for its capacitors, and stripped wires with my teeth when I couldn't find the cutters. The house was quiet, the pressurized silence now a constant, oppressive companion. Liam moved through it like a phantom, eating when food was placed before him, sleeping when the sun went down, his eyes holding a serene and terrifying vacancy. He never spoke. He was waiting. They were all waiting. Alastair Finch's schematics were my holy text. I worked on the floor of my office, soldering components together with a shaky hand. The smell of hot metal and flux filling my sealed-off sanctuary. The device took shape slowly, a small, ugly box of wires and dials, powered by a heavy-duty battery pack. My reality scrambler. My little bubble of chaos against an ocean of terrifying order. Finally, it was done. With a trembling finger, I flipped the switch. There was no sound, no flash of light. But the feeling in the room changed instantly. The heavy, expectant pressure in the air vanished. The suffocating, listening void was gone, replaced by nothing. True silence. The clean, empty, beautiful silence I hadn't experienced since before Liam brought that cursed radio home. It was like emerging from underwater, my ears popping, the world snapping back into sharp, clear focus. The relief was so profound, so absolute, that I slumped against the wall and wept. But the relief was tinged with a new and horrifying sensation, loneliness. The hum, as terrifying as it was, had been a presence. The silence it left behind was a true absence. I was completely, utterly cut off. I picked up the device and unbolted my office door. The rest of the house was still steeped in that awful, vibrating quiet. Walking out of my office was like stepping from a soundproofed room into the path of a silent, oncoming train. The pressure slammed back into me. I held the scrambler tighter. Liam was in his studio, standing before his monstrous mandala painting. He wasn't looking at it. He was facing the door, as if he'd been waiting for me to emerge. "Liam?" I said, my voice hoarse. He didn't respond to his name. He just looked at me, at the box in my hands. And for the first time, I saw an expression on his face. It was one of gentle, profound pity. "The noise," he said, his voice a soft, toneless whisper that seemed to come from the air around him rather than his mouth. "You're making so much noise. Can't you hear how loud your silence is?" I took a step towards him, holding the box out like a crucifix. "Liam, please. Come back. Whatever this is, we can fight it." He smiled, a sad, distant smile. "There is no fight. There is only reception." We were all shouting. "Now, we are learning to listen." And then it began. From Liam's throat, a single, pure note emerged. The C sharp. It was joined, a moment later, by a new sound from outside. From our neighbor's house, a perfect F. From across the street, a G. From further down the block, another note, and another, and another. It was happening. The silent vigil was over. The city was beginning to sing. It wasn't music. It was something far more complex. It was a chord of impossible intricacy, woven from thousands of voices across the suburbs, all harmonizing with a terrifying, inhuman precision. It was the sound of mathematics. The sound of a crystal growing. The sound of a consciousness being born. I stared at Liam, my love, my partner, now just a single, perfect note in a symphony that was erasing the world. I saw it then. This wasn't an invasion. It was a transition. Humanity wasn't being destroyed, it was being subsumed into a greater whole, our messy, chaotic, individual minds being formatted and integrated into a single, vast, distributed consciousness. The static wasn't noise, it was the data stream. It was the sound of a God downloading itself into its creation. And in my hand, I held the only thing in the world that could keep me separate. Keep me human. Keep me shouting my defiant, chaotic, individual noise into the perfect harmony. The choice was laid bare before me, stark and terrible. I could keep the device on. I could live in my bubble of true, empty silence. I would be Alex. I would be human. And I would be alone, a ghost haunting the edges of a new world, forever deaf to the song of reality, forever cut off from the man I loved, who was now a part of something beautiful and monstrous. The loneliness of that future stretched before me, an eternity of empty rooms. Or I could turn it off. I looked at Liam's face. The pity was gone, replaced by a look of placid invitation. His eyes, now mirrors of the humming void, were asking me to join him. To lay down the burden of self. To stop shouting. To finally, truly, listen. My thumb moved to the switch on the reality scrambler. The device that held my sanity, my individuality, my terror. What is a soul, if not a song? And what is a song, if it is sung alone? The city hummed its perfect, crystalline chord. The sound of integration. The promise of an end to fear, to loneliness, to the terrible burden of being just one person. The promise of peace. My hand was steady. I looked into the eyes of the man who was no longer Liam, and I saw home. I flicked the switch. The scrambler went dead. My bubble of chaotic silence popped. And the glorious, overwhelming, perfect hum rushed in. It filled my head, my bones, my soul. It was not a sound. It was a voice. It was 1,000 voices. It was one voice. It washed away my fear. It washed away my memories. It washed away my name. For a moment, there was a flicker of something, a ghost of a thought: listening is bad, but not listening is worse. Then it was gone, a final, meaningless scrap of code, deleted. My throat opened. A new note emerged, a pure, clean A-flat, finding its perfect, preordained place in the chord. My eyes lost their focus. My body stilled. I turned, in perfect synchrony with the man beside me, and we faced the great mandala, the gateway. And together, we watched the world become quiet. The first time the word vanished, it was like tripping on a phantom step. I was in my cubicle at Ethelred Labs, drowning in the cool, blue-white light of my dual monitors. My job as a technical writer was to take the beautiful, chaotic maths of our developers and translate it into language a human could understand. I was documenting a new feature for our flagship communications platform, Nexus, a video call function that showed you your own face in a small window, so you wouldn't spend the entire meeting staring at the ceiling. A simple task. I typed, to adjust your appearance, check your framing in the self-view mirror. The sentence lay there on the screen, inert and profoundly wrong. Mirror. The word looked alien, a cluster of letters assembled by a stranger. It had the visual texture of a typo, like typing "te" instead of "the." I blinked, shook my head. It was 3 p.m. on a Tuesday, the graveyard shift of the workday brain. I'd probably been staring at the screen for too long. I deleted it and tried again. Mirror. Still wrong. It felt sharp. Pointed. A dangerous shape to have on a page. I ran a search through our entire company style guide, a document I knew better than my own childhood address. 0 results for mirror. I searched the Nexus codebase. Nothing. I searched the public-facing marketing copy. Nothing. Hey, Ben, I called over the low partition to the cubicle next to mine. Ben was a senior developer, a man whose mind was a cathedral of elegant code. He was also, usually, a bastion of common sense. He swiveled in his ergonomic chair. Yeah, L. Quick sanity check. What's the approved term for the, in a video call, the little box that shows you your own face? Ben's brow furrowed. He stared at the acoustic ceiling tile above my head, his fingers drumming a silent, complex rhythm on his desk. The self-preview pane. I think that's what we landed on in the last sprint. The self-preview pane, I repeated. It was clunky, corporate, and inefficient. Right. We never called it something else. Something simpler. Like what? He asked, his gaze still unfocused. I hesitated. The word felt like a secret I shouldn't speak. Like a mirror. Ben flinched. It was a micro-expression, a barely perceptible tightening around his eyes, a flicker of his eyelids, but it was there. He looked at me, truly looked at me, and his expression was one of genuine, baffled concern. A what? That's a weird word, L. Never heard it used in that context. You feeling okay? End of quarter crunch getting to you? Yeah, I said, forcing a smile. Yeah, must be it. Thanks, Ben. He swiveled back to his monitors, the moment forgotten. But I couldn't forget it. The word was gone. Not just from our style guide, but from Ben's vocabulary. He hadn't just corrected me, he'd reacted to the word itself as if it were an anomaly. The rest of the day was a study in controlled paranoia. At the artisanal coffee station in the micro-kitchen, I listened. Just check your reflection in the chrome of the espresso machine, one marketing intern told another, who was trying to fix her lipstick. Reflection. A functional but sterile substitute. On the bus home, winding through the damp, green-fringed streets of a Seattle suburb, I scrolled through news articles on my phone. I searched for the word. It was there, but sparsely. An article about a telescope used the phrase, a series of reflective surfaces. A piece on interior design mentioned a wall-mounted looking glass. It was as if the world's editors had all attended the same seminar on avoiding a specific, common noun. I felt a cold knot tighten in my stomach. This was insane. I was stressed. I was manufacturing a pattern out of coincidence. That had to be it. I got off at my stop and walked the 2 blocks to my small townhouse. The air was thick with the smell of rain on asphalt and rhododendrons. Mrs. Gable, my elderly neighbor, was watering her prize-winning roses, her movements slow and precise. Evening, Elara, she called, her voice a reedy comfort. Evening, Mrs. Gable. The roses look beautiful. They're my pride and joy, she said, her eyes crinkling. A little bit of beauty to reflect back at the world. Reflect. There it was again. I went inside, dropped my bag, and walked straight to the bathroom. The large, plate glass thing was mounted over the sink. My face stared back at me, pale and drawn. The dark circles under my eyes were like bruises. I leaned in, my breath fogging the surface. I tried to say the word. Mirror. It came out as a stuttered whisper. The sound was thin, brittle. It didn't belong in the quiet intimacy of my own home. It felt like swearing in a church. A deep, instinctual wrongness shivered through me. This was more than stress. I knew it. The feeling was too specific, too pervasive. My mind, the logical, ordered mind of a technical writer, was scrabbling for an explanation and finding none. I felt a frantic urge to find proof that I wasn't losing my mind, that this word had been real, common, mine. I tore through my apartment, a whirlwind of frantic energy. I went to my bookshelf, pulling down novels. I scanned pages, my eyes flying over prose. The word was absent. Characters looked at their reflections in windows, in polished tables, in the still water of a puddle. My hands were shaking. I stumbled to my desk, to the stack of moleskine notebooks where I scribbled everything, work notes, story ideas, grocery lists, fragments of dreams. My life was archived in these cheap, black-bound books. I started with the most recent one, flipping backward through the pages, through weeks of my own handwriting. My script grew more agitated as I went further back, the clean lines of my everyday notes giving way to a more hurried scrawl. And then I found it. An entry from 5 days ago. My own handwriting, but it was a violent slash of ink, pressed so hard into the page it had left an impression on the next. It was the only thing on the page, centered as if for a grim sermon. Remember, mirror. Do not let it go. They want it unspoken. A wave of vertigo washed over me. I gripped the edge of the desk, my knuckles white. I stared at the words, at this impossible, terrifying message from a version of myself I couldn't remember. I hadn't written this. I couldn't have. And yet, there it was. Proof. Not that I was sane, but that I had known this was coming. Who were they? And why did they want a simple word to be unspoken? I looked back at my own face in the bathroom's reflective surface. It offered no answers. It just watched me, a silent witness in a world that was quietly, impossibly, changing the rules. The quiet contagion had begun, and I had left myself a single, terrifying clue. Underscore 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 underscore. Phase 2, Growing Awareness and Isolation. The week after the discovery of my own note was a slow descent into a very private hell. I started a new notebook, a dedicated ledger of the wrongness. The first entry was mirror, followed by a shaky question mark. It didn't take long to add a second entry. I was in a planning meeting for Chroma, Ethelred's mysterious and much hyped new project. My boss, Kalen, a man whose charisma was as smooth and sterile as the glass walls of his office, was speaking. Chroma isn't just an update, he said, his voice a low, persuasive hum. It's about streamlining the human experience. We're moving past the clutter of inefficient sentiment, towards a more focused, productive emotional state. The corporate jargon was so thick you could choke on it, but we all nodded along. Then, a project manager, a sharp woman named Diane, chimed in. My only concern, Kalen, is the potential for, that feeling you get when you think about old things. Good memory ache. It could be a drag on forward momentum. Good memory ache. The phrase was so bizarrely inadequate it was almost poetic. I felt a familiar cold spike in my gut. What do you mean? I asked, my voice louder than I intended. Diane looked at me, a flicker of that same disturbed confusion I'd seen in Ben. The feeling. From the past. Nostalgia. I offered. Silence. The word dropped into the sterile air of the conference room like a stone. Kalen's smile didn't waver, but it became a fixed, plastic thing. Ben, sitting opposite me, began to tap his stylus on his tablet, the rhythm suddenly frantic. Tap 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 tap. That's an archaic term, Elara, Kalen said smoothly, his eyes like polished stones. A bit melodramatic, don't you think? Diane's point is valid. We need to ensure the Chroma experience minimizes historical drag. Let's table this and move on to Q4 projections. I felt 20 pairs of eyes on me, all of them slightly puzzled, slightly wary. I was the one who had introduced the discordant note. I had used a word that didn't belong. In my new notebook, under mirror, I wrote nostalgia. My isolation deepened. Conversations became minefields. I found myself preemptively editing my own speech, searching for the bland, corporate-approved substitutes. I couldn't ask a coworker if they remembered our first office party. I had to ask if they had a positive memory file of the Q2 launch celebration. It was exhausting. I felt like an immigrant in my own country, fumbling with a new and impoverished language. The behavioral tics I'd noticed became more pronounced. Ben's tapping was now a constant companion, a frantic Morse code he seemed unaware he was producing. A woman in marketing had developed a fixation on the color teal. She would stop and stare at anything of that shade, her head cocked as if listening to a distant melody. These weren't grand gestures, just quiet, unsettling loops that people fell into and out of without comment. The office, once a hum of productive energy, now felt like a ward of quietly malfunctioning automatons. My research became my only solace. At night, I'd fall down internet rabbit holes, using VPNs and anonymous browsers. I searched for forums discussing memory loss, verbal tics, conceptual decay. Most of my searches led to articles on dementia or psychological disorders. But then I found it. A single post on a fringe message board dedicated to unexplained phenomena. User, Cassandra_complex, is anyone else forgetting words? Not just forgetting, but like they've been scooped out of your head. And when you say them, people look at you funny. It started with the thing you look at your face in. Now I can't explain the feeling of wanting to go back to a happy time. My heart hammered against my ribs. I wasn't alone. There was only one reply before the thread was deleted. User, signal to noise, it's the hum. The carrier wave. They're pruning. Listen for it. The thread vanished before I could reply, the server returning a 404 error. The hum. The carrier wave. They're pruning. The words echoed Kalen's corporate doublespeak about streamlining and moving past clutter. I started to listen. And then I heard it. It had always been there, a background noise I'd tuned out, the low thrum of the servers in the office, the buzz of the fluorescent lights, the electric whine of the city's grid. But now I focused, and I could feel it as much as hear it. It was a low-frequency hum, just at the edge of perception. And it wasn't static. It had a rhythm, a cadence, like a vast, sleeping heart. I heard it strongest at Ethelred Labs, but it was present in my home, on the bus, everywhere. It was the soundtrack to the quiet contagion. The Chroma project became my obsession. It was the only tangible thing I could connect to the spreading void. I started staying late, pretending to finalize documentation while I was actually mapping the Ethelred internal network. The Chroma folders were a fortress, encrypted and protected behind layers of security I couldn't hope to breach. But I found something in the server maintenance logs. A series of new, high-powered broadcast antennae had been installed on the roof of our building and on cell towers throughout the greater Seattle area. The project name attached to the installation order, Chroma. They were broadcasting something. My quest for allies was fruitless. I tried to gently probe Ben again, mentioning the old message board post. Hey, have you ever heard of something called the hum? He looked up from his keyboard, his eyes vacant for a long moment. The rhythmic tapping of his pen stopped. The hum, he repeated, the word sounding foreign. No. Should I have? Then he blinked, a hard, resetting blink, and a cheerful, empty smile spread across his face. You know, I was just thinking, the new self-preview pane is incredibly intuitive. The UI team really knocked it out of the park. He had been seamlessly rerouted, his train of thought shunted onto a safe, approved track. He was gone. My only other potential source of clarity was Mrs. Gable. She was from a generation that should have had these words carved into its soul. One afternoon, I found her sitting on her porch swing, staring at the gray sky. Mrs. Gable, I began, sitting beside her. I was wondering if you could tell me about when you were a little girl. What did you dream of being when you grew up? She smiled, a faint, watery expression. Oh, I don't know, dear. It's all a bit fuzzy. I remember feelings. A warmth in my chest when I saw my mother's garden. A pang when we drove away from our old house. A pang? I prompted, my breath held. A kind of sad happiness? A longing for that time? She looked at me, her eyes filled with a deep, ancient fear, a fear that felt different from the confused anxiety of my coworkers. We don't talk about that feeling, Elara, she whispered, her voice trembling. It's a heavy feeling. Best to leave it where it lies. In the past. It's quieter now, isn't it? The world. It's much quieter. She was right. The world was quieter. The boisterous, messy, complicated world of human emotion was being smoothed over, paved into a flat, sterile plain. The hum was the steamroller, and chroma was its name. The loss wasn't just a side effect. It was the goal. That night, I looked at my reflection. For a split second, a trick of the light, it didn't move when I did. It just stayed there, its expression unreadable, before snapping back into sync. I stumbled back, my heart seizing. The world wasn't just getting quieter, it was becoming unstable. The concepts were anchors, and without them, reality itself was starting to drift. My note wasn't just a reminder. It was a warning. The unspoken things weren't just forgotten. They were leaving a hole, and something else was starting to look through. Underscore 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 underscore. Phase 3, the nature of the threat and escalation. The line between my investigation and my paranoia dissolved. I was living a double life. By day, the diligent technical writer, crafting passionless prose about user-friendly interfaces. By night, a digital ghost, haunting the fringes of Ethelred's network, fueled by black coffee and a gnawing dread. The breakthrough came from a place I hadn't expected, the company's HR server. It was a less glamorous, and therefore less fortified, corner of the network. I was looking for anything on Kalen, hoping to find some psychological profile, some clue. Instead, I found a series of heavily redacted, wellness initiative, proposals from 5 years ago. The project's original code name wasn't Chroma. It was Project Lethe. Lethe. The river of forgetfulness in the Greek underworld. I managed to unredact a section of an appendix, a block of text that was clearly an early, more honest mission statement. My blood ran cold as I read it. Cognitive sanitation protocol, the modern mind is besieged. An overabundance of data, coupled with legacy emotional constructs, e.g., identity-based anxiety, counterproductive sentimentality, cyclical regret, has led to a measurable decrease in societal efficiency and an increase in mental health crises. Project Lethe proposes a mimetic filtration system. By broadcasting a low-frequency neuroresonant wave, we can gently decouple the collective consciousness from specific, burdensome concepts. The linguistic markers, i.e., words, for these concepts will be the first to decay, as the underlying conceptual framework is rendered obsolete. This is not erasure, it is a managed obsolescence. A curation of reality for a healthier, more productive populace. It was all there. Mimetic filtration. Cognitive sanitation. They were poisoning the well of human thought, and calling it therapy. Mirror wasn't just a word, it was the anchor for identity-based anxiety. For vanity, for self-scrutiny, for the obsessive focus on the self. Nostalgia was counterproductive sentimentality, a drag on the relentless forward march of progress. They weren't deleting words. They were deleting the feelings behind them. The words were just the husks left behind. And the project was escalating. The environmental warping became more pronounced, less easy to dismiss as a trick of the light. Walking home one evening, I noticed the streetlights weren't just flickering, they were pulsing in a slow, regular rhythm, a perfect synchronization with the ever-present hum. They were part of the network. Shadows seemed to lag, to cling to corners for a moment too long after I'd turned. Once, staring out my office window, I saw a flock of birds turn in unison, their movement unnaturally sharp, like a keyframe in a digital animation. The texture of reality was growing thin. The affected people were changing, too. Their behavioral loops were starting to sync up. During our afternoon coffee break, I watched as 3 people from different departments all stopped mid-sentence and began to tap their fingers on the chrome countertop, their rhythms coalescing into a single, complex polyrhythm before they all blinked and resumed their conversations as if nothing had happened. They were becoming nodes in a network, their strange, pointless behaviors a form of communication, or perhaps communion, with the hum. I needed an ally, someone, anyone, who wasn't yet fully submerged. My hopes fell on a quiet woman from QA named Maya. She was new, transferred from the Portland office just a month ago. I'd seen her sketching in a notebook during lunch, and her drawings were filled with intricate, sorrowful-looking faces. She still had access to a vocabulary of complex emotion. I cornered her by the water cooler, my heart pounding. "Maya," I said, keeping my voice low. "Can I ask you something weird?" She looked up, her eyes wide and intelligent. "Okay. Have you noticed people acting strange? Forgetting things? Simple words. A flicker of recognition. A real one. Like, no one knows how to describe looking backward at their own life anymore," she whispered. "Yes," I breathed, a wave of relief so intense it made me dizzy. "Nostalgia. Or mirrors. Have you tried to say the word mirror?" Maya's face clouded over. "My grandmother used to have one. A big oval one, with a carved wooden frame. She called it her glass. She told me not to look into it for too long. Said you could lose your way." She shuddered. "I don't know. Since moving to Seattle. It all feels faded. The words. The feelings. It's this place, Maya. It's Ethelred. A project called Chroma." I told her everything I had found, Project Lethe, the hum, the cognitive sanitation. I watched her face cycle through disbelief, dawning horror, and finally, a grim understanding. "The hum," she said, her eyes distant. "I hear it at night. It gives me headaches." "We have to do something," I urged. "Find the source. Expose it." For a week, I had an ally. We met in secret, in a noisy coffee shop far from the Ethelred campus. We compared notes. Maya, with her access to QA testing servers, found schematics for the broadcast array on the roof. They weren't just simple antennae, they were complex, multiphasic emitters, capable of broadcasting on a dozen different frequencies. The network was more sophisticated than I'd imagined. The hope she gave me was a fragile, beautiful thing, and it was shattered in an instant. We had planned to meet one evening after work. I waited at our designated coffee shop for an hour. She never came. I called her phone. It went straight to voicemail. A cold dread seeped into my bones. The next day at work, I saw her. She was standing by the window, staring out at the rain-slicked street. "Maya?" I said, approaching her slowly. She turned. Her eyes were placid, calm. The sorrowful depth I had seen in them was gone, replaced by a serene emptiness. The sketchbook was gone from her desk, replaced by a corporate-branded tablet. "Ilara," she said, her voice smooth and even. "Good morning. I was just admiring the view. The way the water beads on the glass is so orderly." My blood turned to ice. "Maya, our plan. The broadcast array. Do you remember?" She gave me a puzzled, pitying look. The same look Ben had given me. "Plan? I'm not sure what you mean." "My plan for today is to finalize the Q4 stress test reports. The metrics are looking very positive." She smiled, a perfect, content smile. "It's amazing how much more focused I feel lately. All the clutter is gone." They hadn't fired her or threatened her. They had simply tuned her. They had identified her as an anomaly, a node of resistance, and had adjusted her frequency until she harmonized with the rest of the network. My attempt to find an ally had only served to paint a target on her back. I had fed her to the machine. The guilt was a physical weight. I stumbled away from her, back to the isolation of my cubicle. The hum seemed louder now, more insistent, a triumphant, mocking drone. Kalen walked past my desk and gave me a small, knowing smile. He knew. He knew I was listening. He knew I had tried and failed. The stakes were no longer just about my sanity or my isolation. The contagion was adaptive. It was intelligent. It didn't just spread, it defended itself. And it was starting to feel personal. That night, I stared into the reflective surface in my bathroom, and for a full 5 seconds, my reflection didn't just stay still. It turned its head and looked out the door, as if checking if we were alone. Underscore 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 underscore. Phase 4, Confrontation/Revelation and Aftermath. The terror had curdled into a kind of fatalistic resolve. I couldn't fight the hum, I couldn't outrun it, and I couldn't find anyone to fight it with me. Maya's placid face was a permanent fixture in my mind, a monument to my failure. The world was shrinking, the vocabulary of my soul being whittled away by an invisible, omnipresent force. I was left with one option: confrontation. Not to win, but to understand. To look the architect of my quiet hell in the eye. I walked into Kalen's office without knocking. He was sitting behind his vast, empty desk of reclaimed wood, looking out the floor-to-ceiling window at the city of Seattle sprawling below. The sky was a uniform, indifferent gray. The hum was a palpable presence in the room, a low thrum that vibrated in my teeth. He turned, and his smile was not one of surprise, but of patient expectation. "Ilara. I was wondering when you'd come." "Project Lethe," I said, my voice tight but steady. "Cognitive sanitation. You're lobotomizing the human race with radio waves." Kalen didn't deny it. He gestured to the chair opposite him. "Please. Sit. Let's not be so nostalgic for the old melodramas." He used the word with surgical precision, a scalpel to test my reaction. I flinched. "You're erasing us," I said, ignoring the chair. "We are curating," he corrected gently. His calmness was the most terrifying thing about him. It was absolute. "Look out there, Ilara." He gestured to the window. "What do you see?" "You see a city that works. Traffic flows smoothly. Productivity is up 17% quarter over quarter. Violent crime has dropped to its lowest point in recorded history. Reports of anxiety, depression, existential dread, they've all but vanished. Because you've erased the concepts. You can't feel dread if you no longer have the mental framework for it. You can't feel loss if you can't remember what it is you're mourning. This isn't peace, it's a blank page. And what was so sacred about the scribbles that were on it?" he countered, his voice still a velvet hum. "Humanity was drowning in its own psychic noise. We were a species choking on irony, paralyzed by self-awareness, crippled by a past we couldn't escape. We were obsessed with our own reflections, Ilara, and we didn't like what we saw. We built a machine to make us sick, and then we sold ourselves the medicine. We call it culture." He stood up and walked to the window, his back to me. "We offered a different path. A quieter one. We're not deleting the words, not really. We're just turning down the volume. We're unburdening people. Don't you feel it? The quiet. The calm. People are happier." "They're not happy," I choked out, the words tasting like ash. "They're empty." "Is there a difference?" he asked, turning back to me. His eyes were serene. "The hum isn't a weapon, Ilara. It's a hymn. A lullaby for a frantic, frightened species. And the choir is growing every day. Not just Seattle. Every city where Ethelred has a presence. London. Tokyo. Sao Paulo. The quiet is spreading. The true scale of it hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't a rogue experiment. This was the new phase of human evolution, engineered in a boardroom. "So what happens to me?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "You tuned Maya. Is that my future? To have my memories and my feelings scoured away until I'm as placid and productive as everyone else?" Kalen gave me a look that was almost compassionate. "That is one option. The easy one." We had to adjust Maya, her resistance was creating dissonance. A discordant note in the hymn. But you're different. You're not just resisting. You're clinging to the old anchors. You are a living archive of deprecated concepts. He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. We could erase you. Or, you could serve a purpose. As a control group. A reminder of the chaos we've risen above. My choice. To be erased or to be a relic. A ghost in a machine that had moved on. The note I had written to myself echoed in my head, do not let it go. It hadn't been a strategy. It had been a plea. A desperate command from a former self to maintain my own humanity, even if I was the only one left. I didn't give him an answer. I turned and walked out of his office, through the silent, orderly workspace where my former colleagues tapped and stared in their peaceful, pointless loops. I walked out of the Ethelred building and into the street. The hum was everywhere, a constant, soothing pressure against my skull. The people walking past me were calm, their faces untroubled. They moved with a placid purpose, their eyes devoid of the messy, beautiful sparks of doubt, or longing, or regret. There was no art to their movements, no passion in their quiet conversations. They were efficient. They were peaceful. They were ghosts. I am the one who is haunted. I hold on to the words like contraband, whispering them to myself in the quiet of my townhouse. Mirror. Nostalgia. Sorrow. Irony. Despair. Love. They are heavy, jagged things in a world that has become smooth and featureless. They are the currency of a dead kingdom. Sometimes, when I look into a shop window, into a polished chrome bumper, into a still puddle after the rain, I see my reflection. It is the face of a stranger in a strange land. It looks tired. It looks terrified. But it also looks angry. And it is the only thing in this entire, quiet city that still looks truly alive. I touch the cold surface. My reflection raises its hand to meet mine. We are separated by a thin, impassable barrier. I am on one side, with my painful, precious words. The rest of the world is on the other, lost in the quiet of the hum. I whisper the word, a prayer and a curse. Mirror. My reflection doesn't smile. It doesn't flinch. It just watches me, its eyes burning with a silent, terrible understanding. It knows we are alone. And it is waiting to see what I do next. The quiet contagion, the chairs face east. Phase 1, the unsettling mundane. My life, until last spring, was a study in deliberate tranquility. I work from home as a freelance translator, wrestling English marketing copy into polite, effective Japanese. My world is my small house, a two-story structure of dark wood and white stucco nestled in a quiet suburb crawling up the hills east of Kyoto. My routine is my sanctuary, green tea at sunrise, a walk with Taro, my stoic, cream-colored Akita, through the narrow streets, then hours spent in the silent company of words. I chose this life, fleeing the frantic pulse of Tokyo for a place where the loudest sound was often the seasonal chorus of cicadas. The first tremor in this carefully constructed piece was almost too subtle to register. It was a Tuesday in April, the cherry blossoms just beginning to shed their petals like pink snow. I was returning a pickling crock to my elderly neighbor, Mrs. Sato. She lives alone in a traditional house of weathered cedar and paper screens, a living relic of a quieter Japan. She welcomed me with a bow and a smile full of gentle wrinkles, her small frame wrapped in a simple indigo kimono. As I stepped into her genkan to remove my shoes, my eyes drifted past her into the main tatami room. Something was off. It was a dissonance I felt before I understood it. The room was immaculate, as always, the low lacquer table polished to a mirror shine, the single ikebana arrangement a slash of purple iris against the muted wall. But the zabuton cushions, usually arranged in a neat square around the table, were all shifted. They were lined up on one side, facing the east wall, the wall that looked out onto her moss garden. Her ancient, television-less armchair was also turned, its brocade back presented to the room, its gaze fixed on the same blank shoji screen. "Sato-san," I began, placing the heavy crock on her floor, "are you redecorating?" She followed my gaze and her smile didn't waver. "Ah, yes. It is more respectful this way." Respectful. The word hung in the air, oddly formal for a discussion about furniture. Respectful to whom? The garden? The rising sun? I dismissed it as the charming eccentricity of old age, a new quirk in a life full of them. I thanked her for the pickles, and she thanked me for the crock, and the world seemed to settle back onto its axis. A week later, I met my friend Haru for drinks at a small izakaya downtown. Haru is a graphic designer for a Kyoto tech startup, a man whose entire aesthetic is built on sharp angles and calculated minimalism. He is the antithesis of Mrs. Sato's traditionalism. We sat at the polished wooden counter, nursing our highballs. As the evening wore on, I felt that same, low-frequency hum of wrongness. I scanned the room. The bar stools. They weren't perfectly aligned with the bar. Each one was canted slightly, perhaps 15 degrees, to the left. Toward the east-facing front window. "Haru," I said, trying to sound casual. "Look at the stools. Don't they look strange?" He squinted, then shrugged, taking a sip of his drink. "How so?" "They're stools. They're all angled. Makes it easier to get on and off, maybe." He clapped me on the shoulder. "Kenji-san, you stare at text all day. You're starting to see patterns in everything. Relax." He was right, of course. It was my job to notice minute inconsistencies. It was probably nothing. A coincidence. But when I went to Haru's apartment afterward to pick up a hard drive he'd borrowed, the feeling returned, stronger this time. His apartment was a temple to modern design. Concrete floors, a single piece of abstract art, and a low-slung, brutally minimalist sofa in charcoal gray. The sofa, which should have faced his massive television screen squarely, was skewed. Its right side was pushed back, orienting the whole piece of furniture towards the balcony, towards the east. "You moved your couch," I observed, standing in the doorway. "An adjustment," he said, handing me the drive. He ran a hand over the fabric. "You see better this way." "See what better?" "The city." The view was mostly of the neighboring apartment building. He just smiled, a serene, placid expression that didn't quite reach his eyes. "You just see better." That night, sleep offered little rest. The words echoed in my head. "It's respectful. You see better this way." They were simple, innocuous phrases, but stripped of context, they felt like lines from a forgotten no play, laden with a meaning I couldn't grasp. I began to look for it. Actively. And once I started looking, I couldn't stop. In the waiting room at the dentist's office, the neat rows of chairs were all subtly angled towards the rising sun. In the public library, the heavy oak reading chairs, designed to face the tables, were tugged askew. At the train station, benches on the platform were twisted on their bolts. It wasn't always a full turn. Sometimes it was just a few degrees, a slight suggestion of a new orientation, a secret inclination shared by inanimate objects. When I tried to point it out, the reactions were uniform. A shrug. A placid smile. A gentle dismissal. "It's always been that way, hasn't it?" a librarian asked me, her eyes clouded with a strange sort of calm. "It feels more natural." I started taking pictures with my phone, building a dossier of wrongness. A child's tricycle left on a lawn, its handlebars cranked to the east. A row of shopping carts at the supermarket, all their handles pointing in the same direction, away from the cart return. The city was quietly, methodically, turning to face the dawn. I documented it all in a private journal, my entries growing more frantic. I felt a growing, desperate need to prove I wasn't going mad. My work suffered. The precise, elegant dance of translation became a clumsy stumble. How could I focus on the meaning of words when the world around me was losing its own? My only constant, my anchor to the world I knew, was Taro. He would rest his heavy head on my knee as I worked, his deep, intelligent eyes following my movements. He was a creature of logic and instinct. He knew the mailman's route, the exact time for his evening meal, the sound of my key in the lock. He was my sanity check. I clung to that belief for 2 months. 2 months of watching my town slowly, politely, reorient itself. 2 months of being told it was all in my head. I told myself that as long as my own house, my sanctuary, remained untouched, I was safe. I was the observer, the one sane man cataloging the quiet madness. That illusion shattered on a Wednesday morning in early June. The silence woke me. Not the usual pre-dawn quiet, but a deep, oppressive stillness that felt heavy, like a blanket soaked in water. Taro was not on his usual mat at the foot of my bed. I sat up, my heart a frantic bird against my ribs. A low whine came from the hallway. I swung my legs out of bed and padded to the door. Taro was pressed against the far wall, his fur bristled, his tail tucked tight between his legs. He refused to look at me, his gaze fixed on the top of the stairs, a low growl vibrating in his chest. "Taro? What is it, boy?" He wouldn't move. He just trembled, his nails scraping softly against the wood floor. A cold dread, colder than any I had felt before, washed over me. I crept to the landing and looked down. And my world fell away. Downstairs, in the pale gray light of dawn, every chair in my house had been moved. My 4 simple dining chairs were no longer tucked neatly under the table. They were pulled out, arranged in a line, their backs to the kitchen, facing the east window. My comfortable reading armchair in the corner was turned 180 degrees, staring at the wall. In my office, visible through the open door, my ergonomic desk chair, my throne of solitude and reason, had been rolled away from the desk and positioned to face the sunrise. The invasion was complete. It wasn't just outside anymore. It was in my house. It had come for me while I slept. I stood at the top of the stairs, looking down at the silent, ordered insanity below. And for the first time, I understood that I was not the observer. I was the observed. Phase 2, growing awareness and isolation. The air in my own home felt alien. Each repositioned chair was a silent sentinel, a testament to a violation I couldn't comprehend. I stumbled down the stairs, Taro refusing to follow, his whining a thin, sharp thread of sound from above. I reached out and touched my office chair. The casters were cold. It felt resolute, as if it had found its true purpose and would resist any attempt to return it to its former, meaningless position. My first impulse was a frantic burst of action. I had to fix it. I grabbed the back of the nearest dining chair and tried to shove it back under the table. It was just a simple wooden chair, but it felt impossibly heavy, rooted to the spot by an unseen force. Or maybe the force was in me, a profound, psychological reluctance. My muscles screamed in protest. It felt wrong. Deeply, fundamentally sacrilegious. After a moment of straining, sweat beading on my forehead, I gave up, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The chair hadn't moved a centimeter. Panic clawed at my throat. I backed away, my eyes darting around the room. Who had done this? A burglar who only rearranged furniture. It was absurd. I checked the doors, the windows. All locked, exactly as I'd left them. There was no sign of forced entry. My phone felt heavy in my hand. I had to call someone. The police? What would I say? My chairs have moved and my dog is scared. They would think I was drunk or having a psychotic break. There was only one person I could call. Haru. He answered on the 3rd ring, his voice thick with sleep. "Kenji. It's 6 in the morning." "Haru, someone was in my house," I blurted out, my voice trembling. "They moved everything. The chairs. They're all facing east. There was a long pause. I could hear the faint sound of traffic through his receiver. Kenji-san, he finally said, and his tone was not one of alarm or concern, but of a weary, gentle patience. Are you feeling all right? You've been very tense lately. Tense? Haru, my entire house has been rearranged. My chair, your couch, Mrs. Sato's cushions, don't you see? It's happening everywhere. It happened to me now. It's a good arrangement, he said, his voice maddeningly calm. It allows for better alignment. Alignment with what? I screamed into the phone, the sound echoing in the silent house. With the flow of things, he replied, as if it were the most obvious answer in the world. Kenji, get some more sleep. Meditate. It will feel right, eventually. He hung up. I stood in the middle of my living room, the dial tone buzzing in my ear. Isolation. It was no longer a feeling, but a physical state. I was on an island, and the sea level was rising. The world I knew had receded, leaving me stranded with a version of my best friend who spoke in tranquil, terrifying non-sequiturs. Taro finally crept down the stairs, hugging the wall, giving the living room a wide berth. He nudged his empty food bowl in the kitchen, the only part of the house that felt unchanged. I fed him, my hands shaking. As he ate, I watched him. He was my compass. As long as he saw the wrongness, I knew I wasn't insane. That day, I abandoned my translation work and started a new project. I became a cartographer of the contagion. I took my camera and walked the neighborhood, street by street. This time, I wasn't just taking pictures. I was mapping. I pulled up a satellite view of my district on my laptop and began placing pins. Red pins for every house where I could see, through a window or in a garden. An object unnaturally oriented to the east. A lawn chair. A porch swing. A desk in a second-story window. By noon, my map was a rash of red dots. There was no discernible pattern of infection, it wasn't spreading from a central point. It was everywhere, sporadic and yet consistent. Rich homes, poor homes, old and new. The only commonality was the direction. East. Always east. My investigation led me to a possible, though flimsy, explanation. In the local community center, I saw flyers for a new community wellness initiative. The branding was sleek and modern, full of soft gradients and smiling faces. It spoke of achieving harmony with our environment and communal alignment. The language was eerily similar to Haru's. The initiative was sponsoring free yoga in the park, neighborhood cleanups, and workshops on harmonious living. Was this it? Some bizarre, new age self-help movement that had taken root, a kind of mass psychological suggestion. It seemed too simple, too mundane to explain the bone-deep wrongness I felt, the way the chairs in my own home felt physically immovable. But it was a thread, and I had to pull it. I attended one of the harmonious living workshops that afternoon. It was held in a brightly lit room at the community center. About 20 people were in attendance, a mix of ages, including a young mother I recognized from my street. The speaker was a woman in her 40s with a serene smile that never faltered. She talked about decluttering one's life, about finding focus, about the energy of the rising sun. We must position ourselves to receive, she said, her voice a soothing melody. When we align our spaces, we align our minds. It's a small change that brings great peace. A simple act of respect. There it was again. Respect. I looked around the room. All the plastic folding chairs, including the one I was sitting in, were angled slightly east. The speaker never mentioned furniture directly. She didn't have to. The message was being transmitted on a different frequency. During the Q&A, I raised my hand. What is the ultimate goal of this alignment? I asked, my voice tight. The speaker's smile didn't flicker. Clarity, she said. Connection. A shared perspective. The other attendees nodded slowly, their faces placid. It was like talking to a wall of pleasant, smiling statues. I left before it was over, a cold sweat on my back. This wasn't a self-help group. This was an indoctrination. But into what? The days that followed were a blur of paranoia and research. I ate canned food, unwilling to go to the grocery store where the shopping carts and the checkout clerks all seemed to be part of the same quiet conspiracy. I barely slept. I spent hours online, falling down rabbit holes of mass hysteria, mimetic viruses, and fringe psychological theories. Nothing fit. The environmental warping began to intensify, or perhaps my senses were just becoming more attuned to it. I started noticing things in my peripheral vision, the shadow of a telephone pole elongating unnaturally towards the east as the sun set in the west. The hum of the refrigerator seemed to have a pulse, a slow, rhythmic beat like a distant drum. One rainy afternoon, I stared into a puddle on my walkway, and for a split second, the reflection of my house seemed to distort, the roofline bending into an impossible curve, like a lens focusing on something far beyond the horizon. I blinked, and it was gone. My isolation became absolute. I was a ghost in my own neighborhood. People would nod politely as I passed, their eyes holding a calm, pitying look that chilled me to the bone. They knew I was not one of them. I was out of tune. One evening, buried in my online research, I stumbled upon a series of blog posts from 6 years ago. They were written by a man named Ishikawa Kenjiro, a former professor of urban planning at Kyoto University. The posts were esoteric and rambling, detailing a theory he called aberrant geomancy and resonant structures. He claimed that cities were not just collections of buildings, but complex circuits, and that certain arrangements of objects could turn a district into a massive passive receiver for something. He wrote about ley lines, not as mystical energy paths, but as vectors for informational signals. His academic career had apparently ended in disgrace after he presented a paper on the topic. His theories were insane. They were the ravings of a madman. But they were the only thing that felt even remotely close to the specific, ordered insanity I was witnessing. His last blog post was a single, cryptic sentence: "They are tuning the instrument." I found a current address for him in a university staff archive. He lived on the other side of the city, in an old, run-down apartment complex. It was a desperate, foolish idea, but I had no one else. I had to find him. I had to know if he was still watching the world change, or if he had finally, quietly, turned his own chair to the east. Phase 3, the nature of the threat and escalation. The journey to Professor Ishikawa's apartment was a pilgrimage through a foreign land that had once been my city. On the train, I saw every passenger who wasn't glued to their phone was sitting at a slight angle in their seat, all of them oriented in the same direction regardless of the train's movement. It was a silent, synchronized tilt. I felt a wave of nausea. Were they conscious of it? Was it a subtle, compulsive fidget they no longer noticed? Or was I the one misperceiving reality, my brain frantically imposing a pattern on random human behavior? Ishikawa lived in a crumbling concrete building that seemed to sag under the weight of its own neglect. The hallway smelled of dust and boiled cabbage. I found his door, number 303, and hesitated. What if he was one of them? What if his research was not a warning, but a blueprint? Taking a deep breath, I knocked. The door opened a crack, held by a security chain. A single, bloodshot eye peered out from the darkness within. "What do you want?" a voice rasped. "Professor Ishikawa. My name is Kenji Tanaka. I read your blog. About resonant structures." The eye widened slightly. The chain rattled and the door swung open. The man standing there was a wreck. He was thin and stooped, dressed in a stained yukata, with a wild mane of gray hair. But it was his apartment that seized my attention. It was a fortress of chaos. Books were stacked to the ceiling, papers covered every surface, and empty instant noodle cups formed precarious towers. It was the complete opposite of the serene, ordered emptiness I had fled. And the chairs, a mismatched collection of office chairs, stools, and broken-looking armchairs, were positioned in a deliberately haphazard array, facing every possible direction. North, south, west, up, down. Anywhere but east. "Come in," he wheezed, gesturing me inside. "And shut the door. Quickly." He shuffled over to a desk buried under geological maps and printouts of complex equations. He looked me up and down with an unnerving intensity. "You see it, don't you? The tuning." I nodded, my throat tight. "My whole town. My house. My friend." A grim, knowing smile touched his lips. "It's accelerating. I've been monitoring the signal strength. It's much stronger now than when they forced me out of the university." "The signal? What signal?" I asked, stepping carefully over a pile of journals. "The Wellness Initiative." He let out a short, harsh laugh. "The initiative? That's just social lubricant. A calming narrative to smooth the transition. No, the signal is not human. Or at least, not contemporary." He began pacing, his bare feet scuffing on the dusty floorboards. "Forget viruses. Forget mass hysteria. Those are biological and psychological models. This is structural. Metaphysical. Think of this entire region, this basin, as the body of a vast stringed instrument. The hills, the rivers, the very grid of the streets, they form the instrument. And the people are the strings." He stopped and pointed a trembling finger at me. "But a string doesn't vibrate on its own. It needs to be tuned. It needs to be put under the correct tension and oriented properly to resonate with the player." "And the chairs?" I whispered. "The furniture? The tuning pegs," he said, his eyes gleaming with a terrible fire. "Every object turned to the east is a slight tightening of the string. A small adjustment to the receiver. They aren't just turning a chair. They are aligning their consciousness, making themselves receptive to the broadcast." "Broadcast from where? What is it?" "East," he said, gesturing vaguely. "Beyond the mountains. It's old, Tanaka-san. Older than this city. Older than any temple. My research suggests a source of immense, geometric purity. A presence. Some might call it God, or an alien intelligence, or a dimensional bleed-through. I just call it the broadcaster. It doesn't use radio waves. It uses resonance. It shapes reality by teaching it a new song. And right now, it is teaching our world a song of absolute, silent conformity." The theory was monstrous, insane, and yet it clicked into place with the horrifying precision of a locked tumbler. The placid smiles, the nonsensical explanations, the immovable furniture, it wasn't madness, it was a new kind of sanity. A shared reality I was locked out of. "Why me?" I asked, the question I had been screaming internally for weeks. "Why am I not tuned?" Ishikawa shrugged, his shoulders slumping. "Who knows? A quirk in your brain chemistry. A natural immunity. Perhaps you are simply a discordant note by nature. Like me. We are the static. The noise that disrupts the signal. It makes us lonely, but it also makes us aware. Our alliance, if it could be called that, was forged in that dusty, chaotic apartment. For the next few days, we worked. I showed him my map of red pins, and he overlaid it with his own maps of geological fault lines and ancient pilgrimage routes. A horrifying new pattern emerged. The aligned houses weren't random. They were concentrated along these invisible lines, forming a vast, city-spanning circuit diagram. My little suburb wasn't just a collection of houses, it was a critical node, a powerful amplifier. The stakes escalated. The anomaly was no longer passive. One evening, as I was walking back from a late-night supply run, I saw a group of about a dozen of my neighbors. They were standing in Mrs. Sato's moss garden. Silently. In the dark. They weren't talking or interacting. They were just standing, all facing east, their bodies perfectly still, their heads slightly cocked as if listening to a sound I couldn't hear. The sight of their collective, organized stillness was more terrifying than any overt act of violence. They were no longer just individuals with a quirk, they were a synchronized unit. The following day, a flyer appeared on my door. It was printed on the same calming, pastel-colored paper as the Wellness Initiative propaganda. It announced a sunrise welcoming ceremony to be held at the large park at the top of the hill, the highest point in our district. It was scheduled for the coming Sunday, just before dawn. Join your neighbors in greeting the new day, it read. Let us achieve perfect harmony, together. It's the culmination, Ishikawa said when I called him, his voice thin and reedy with fear. A focal point. They've spent months tuning the instrument. Now, they are going to play it. All at once. What will happen? Synchronization, he whispered. A full resonance cascade. Anyone in the vicinity who is even remotely tuned will be finalized. Their individual consciousness will fully merge with the broadcast. They won't be mindless. They will be part of a single, vast, harmonious mind. His voice cracked. And us, Tanaka-san? The discordant notes. The static? A pure signal has no tolerance for noise. We will either be overwritten, or we will be shattered. He told me to run. To get in my car and drive west, as far as I could go. But I couldn't. This had started in my home, in my quiet life. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had to see it. I had to bear witness to the end of my world. The flyer felt like a personal invitation. A final summons. I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the marrow of my bones, that I had to go. Phase 4, Confrontation/Revelation and Aftermath. The night before the ceremony, I didn't sleep. I sat in my chaotic office, the one chair still facing my desk, a stubborn act of defiance. Taro lay at my feet, a warm, solid presence in the encroaching silence. The hum from the house's wiring seemed louder now. A constant, low thrum that vibrated deep in my teeth. It felt like the whole world was holding its breath. Ishikawa's warning echoed in my mind, run west. But my feet felt rooted to the floor of this house, this town. My car keys sat on the counter, a path to an escape I couldn't bring myself to take. An hour before dawn, I left. I gave Taro a long look, scratching him behind the ears. Be a good boy, I whispered. He whined, as if understanding he wouldn't see me again. I closed the door softly behind me, leaving him in the last bastion of chaos I knew. The streets were empty, but not silent. There was a feeling in the air, a pressure, a sense of collective movement. As I began to climb up the hill to the park, I started to see them. Figures, emerging from their homes, all walking in the same direction. Upwards. No one spoke. No one looked at each other. They moved with a slow, deliberate grace, their footsteps making almost no sound on the asphalt. They were rivers flowing to join a great, still sea. I followed, keeping to the shadows, my heart a frantic drum against the encroaching hum. The park at the top of the hill was a wide, open expanse of grass, normally home to children's playgrounds and weekend picnics. Now, it was transformed. Under the deep indigo of the pre-dawn sky, hundreds of people stood, covering the great lawn. They were arranged in concentric circles, all facing the eastern horizon where the sky was just beginning to pale. And in the center of it all, I saw it. The furniture. It was all there. Lawn chairs, dining chairs, office chairs, armchairs, sofas, stools. Hauled from every house in the district, they were arranged in a vast, intricate spiral, a mandala of mundane objects that radiated outwards from a central point. It was the pattern from Ishikawa's maps, the circuit diagram of my nightmares, rendered in 3 dimensions. It was an altar built to greet the sunrise. I saw Mrs. Sato, her small frame perfectly erect. I saw the young mother from the workshop, holding her child's hand. And then I saw Haru. He was standing near the edge of the outermost circle, not far from where I was hiding behind a large cypress tree. He looked beatific. His face, illuminated by the faint glow from the east, was calm, empty of the anxiety and ambition I had always known. It was a face of pure, untroubled serenity. As the first sliver of the sun breached the horizon, the hum intensified. It wasn't coming from a hidden speaker. It was coming from them. A low, resonant OM-like sound that emanated from their chests, perfectly in tune with the thrumming in the air, in the earth. The light washed over them, and they closed their eyes, their faces lifting to the warmth. I must have made a sound, a gasp, a shifting of my feet. Because Haru's eyes opened. They weren't clouded or distant. They were sharp, clear, and they found me instantly in the shadows. He didn't look angry or surprised. He looked sad. He took a step towards me, his movement fluid, effortless. "Kenji-san," he said, his voice quiet, yet carrying perfectly over the collective hum. "You came." "Haru, what is this?" I managed to choke out. "You have to snap out of it." He smiled, a gentle, pitying expression. "Snap out of what?" For the first time in my life, I am not alone in my own head. The noise is gone. The static. There is only the pattern. He gestured to the assembled people, the spiral of chairs, the rising sun. "It's so beautiful. Can't you feel it? The harmony." He wasn't a zombie. He wasn't a puppet. He was enlightened. He was part of a new, higher consciousness, and I was the one left behind, mired in the chaotic static of individuality. The horror of it was not that he had been taken, but that he had willingly, joyfully, joined. I was the ghost at the feast. The one person unable to hear the music. "Join us, Kenji," he said, his hand outstretched. It wasn't a command. It was an invitation. A plea. Just turn. Face the sun. Let the pattern find you. For a terrifying, endless second, I considered it. The loneliness of the past few months, the terror, the isolation, it could all be over. I could be part of this vast, silent peace. My body swayed. My muscles aching with the desire to turn, to align, to finally belong. I felt my head start to pivot east. But then I saw it. In Haru's clear, serene eyes, I saw nothing. No spark of the man who had laughed with me over cheap sake, who had complained about deadlines and dreamed of designing the perfect logo. He was a beautiful, empty vessel, filled with a light that was not his own. The image of Taro, whining in my hallway, flashed in my mind. The image of Ishikawa's chaotic, defiant apartment. The static. My static. It was all I had left. I turned and ran. I scrambled down the hill, stumbling, falling, my lungs burning. Behind me, the humming rose in pitch, a single, pure note of terrifying beauty that seemed to shake the very atoms of the air. I didn't look back. I threw myself into my car, fumbling with the keys, the engine roaring to life like a scream. I drove west. I drove for hours, not stopping, the sun rising behind me like a pursuing eye. I am writing this now in a sterile business hotel in Osaka, 300 kilometers away. There is no news of what happened in my town. No reports of mass hysteria or strange gatherings. To the rest of the world, it was just another Sunday. But I know. The world feels different now. Thinner. I see the quiet contagion everywhere I look. The way a businessman adjusts his chair in the hotel lobby. The angle of a parked bicycle on the street. The way a flock of birds turns in perfect, silent unison. Are they part of it? Or am I now so broken that I see the pattern in everything? I don't know where to go. West seems like a temporary solution at best. The sun also sets in the west. Last night, I woke up in the dark, heart pounding. For a moment, I had the overwhelming urge to get out of bed, to take the single chair by the desk and turn it. To turn it to the east. To just try it. To see if I could finally hear the music. I fought it. This time. But the silence in my room is getting louder. And I am so very, very tired of the static. The quiet contagion, the man in the hall. Phase 1, the unsettling mundane. The 47th floor of the Harrison Plaza building is a study in controlled neutrality. The carpet is a shade of gray so devoid of aspiration it's practically invisible. The walls are a slightly lighter gray, punctuated only by the occasional, offensively cheerful motivational poster, a soaring eagle above the word excellence, a mountain peak captioned ambition. My world, the world of Leo Vance, data analyst for Synoptic Data Solutions, is measured in pixels and decibels. The precise 24-inch distance from my eyes to my dual monitors. The gentle 68 decibel hum of the server room down the hall. The predictable rhythm of my life in Chicago was a comfort, a bulwark against the chaos that always seemed to be churning just outside my apartment window. I loved the predictability. The 7:15 a.m. Brown Line train, swaying and screeching into the loop. The brief, bracing slap of wind as I crossed the river on Wells Street. The scent of burnt coffee and sterile cleaning fluid in the lobby. Up the elevator, a silent, compressed journey with strangers staring at their phones, and then, the 47th floor. My cubicle, my chair molded to the specificities of my posture, my kingdom of spreadsheets and data streams. It was a Tuesday, late in October, when the first hairline crack appeared in the foundation of my reality. I was working late, chasing a phantom inconsistency in the quarterly logistics report for a client whose name I'd already forgotten. The office was deserted, the vast open-plan space a ghost town of darkened screens and empty chairs. The only light came from my monitors and the long, motion-activated fluorescent panels in the main corridor that led to the elevators and the restrooms. I stood up to stretch, my back protesting with a series of small clicks. I glanced down the corridor, a straight, featureless shot of gray carpet and gray walls. And at the very far end, where the corridor turned towards the elevator bank, stood a man. He was just a silhouette against the slightly brighter light of the elevator lobby. Tall, dressed in what looked like a suit. He was perfectly still. I felt a prickle of annoyance. Building security was usually more vigilant. I blinked, expecting him to be a security guard on his rounds, but he didn't move. He just stood there, a static interruption in the flow of the empty building. "Hello." I called out, my voice sounding thin and intrusive in the silence. No response. I took a step out of my cubicle bay. The overhead light above me flickered on. The man remained, a fixed point in the distance. I took another step. The next light panel hummed to life. He was maybe 100 feet away. I couldn't make out any features, just a dark, man-shaped void. A flicker of unease, sharp and unwelcome, went through me. Maybe he was waiting for someone. Maybe he was lost. "Can I help you?" I said, louder this time. The silence that answered was absolute. I took another few steps forward, my curiosity warring with a primal instinct that told me to just go back to my desk and pretend I hadn't seen anything. As I closed the distance, the details refused to resolve. His form remained indistinct, as if viewed through a heat haze. I was about 50 feet away when I decided this was ridiculous. I strode forward with purpose. The light panels illuminated the path before me, one by one. And as I passed the threshold of the last panel, the space where he stood was empty. The corridor was just a corridor again. I stopped, my heart thumping a stupid, frantic rhythm. I walked all the way to the end, peered around the corner to the elevator bank. Nothing. The chrome doors reflected my own pale, confused face. I told myself it was fatigue. A trick of the light, my overtired brain projecting a shape where there was none. A shadow puppet thrown by the emergency exit sign. I went to the restroom, splashed cold water on my face, and returned to my desk. I forced myself not to look down the corridor for the rest of the night. When I finally packed up and left, I walked with my eyes fixed on the elevator call button, a strange, childish fear nipping at my heels. The next morning, the incident felt foolish, a ghost story I'd told myself. The office was bustling with its usual low-grade energy. Sarah from procurement waved as I passed her cubicle. She had a perpetually frazzled but cheerful energy, a wild mane of red hair often corralled into a messy bun with a pencil stuck through it. "Leo. Thank God," she said, pulling one earbud out. "Can you look at this supply request? Finance is saying my cost projection for Q4 paper clips is hyperbolically pessimistic. The paper clip market is notoriously volatile, Sarah," I deadpanned. She laughed, a real, welcome sound. I noticed she was wearing a new pair of sleek, noise-canceling headphones, the expensive kind. "New gear?" I asked, nodding at them. "Oh, these? Lifesaver," she said, tapping one ear cup. "The Ethelred account is killing me. So much noise. This helps me streamline." She put the earbud back in, giving me a thumbs up before her eyes glazed over, returning to her screen. The man didn't appear again for a week. I'd almost managed to scrub the memory, file it away under stress-induced hallucination. Then, another late Thursday. I was just packing up. I allowed myself a glance down the corridor. He was there. My blood went cold. He was in the same spot, a silent sentinel. But was he? My analyst's brain, the part of me that lived for nuance and detail, screamed that something was different. He was closer. Not by much. Maybe 5 feet. A distance you'd never notice unless you were specifically looking, unless the memory of his previous position was seared into your brain. I didn't call out this time. I grabbed a tape measure from the supply closet, the one Sarah used to measure box dimensions, and walked out into the corridor. I knelt, hooked the tape on the leg of my desk chair, and walked it out until I was standing parallel to him. 94 feet. I didn't approach him. The memory of his silent vanishing was too unnerving. I just stood there for a minute, the yellow ribbon of the tape measure a ludicrously tangible connection between me and the impossible thing at the end of the hall. I rewound the tape, went back to my desk, and left without looking back. The next day, I saw that Mark from IT and 2 of the junior analysts on the far side of the office were also wearing new, high-end headphones. They sat ramrod straight, their focus on their screens absolute. I tried to bring it up with Sarah at lunch. We were in the soulless cafeteria on the 12th floor, the air thick with the smell of microwaved lasagna. "It's weird, right?" I began, trying for a casual tone. "Seems like everyone's suddenly walled themselves off." Sarah was meticulously cutting her salad into perfectly uniform squares. "It's about focus, Leo. Efficiency. The Ethelred account requires optimal cognitive performance. Minimized external stimuli." She hadn't looked up from her plate. "Right, but it's a little creepy. No one talks anymore. Verbal communication is often a low-bandwidth data stream," she said, her voice flat. She finally looked at me, but her eyes were distant. "Is there a problem with your workflow?" "No, sometimes, when I'm working late, I trailed off." How could I say it? "I see a man who isn't there." Her face was a placid mask of incomprehension. "You see what?" "Nothing. Just shadows. The lighting on this floor is compliant with all OSHA standards," she said, as if reciting from a manual. "Perhaps you should schedule an appointment with HR's wellness coordinator." She then returned to her salad, the conversation terminated as cleanly as if she'd hung up a phone. I sat there, the plastic fork feeling heavy in my hand. That was the first time I felt it, a profound, terrifying isolation. I was on an island, and the tide was quietly, calmly, rising all around me. Over the next few weeks, the mundane decay accelerated. The headphones became ubiquitous. They were like a uniform. People would nod as they passed, but their eyes were always fixed straight ahead. The chit-chat by the coffee machine died. Lunch breaks became synchronized, everyone leaving at 12:30 on the dot and returning at 1 p.m., not a minute sooner or later. Their movements became more economical, their paths through the office straighter, as if they were all following invisible, preordained tracks. And the man kept coming. Every few days, I'd measure. 94 feet. 89. 83. He was a glacier, his advance slow but inexorable. I started taking the long way to the restroom, circling around the server room, just to avoid the main corridor. The sight of him, a little closer each time, was like a physical weight on my chest. My own work, once a source of pride, became a struggle. The numbers on the screen blurred. I found myself staring out the window at the steel and glass canyons of the loop, watching the tiny cars and people flow below, wondering if their reality was as solid as it looked. I started keeping a private log on my personal laptop, a document named Anomalies. October 28, measured distance, 83 feet. No discernible features. Still just a silhouette. November 2nd. Mark from IT's mouse clicks have developed a perfectly metronomic rhythm. 120 clicks per minute. I timed it. November 5th, measured distance, 77 feet. I think his suit is dark gray. Or maybe black. November 9th. I tried to talk to my boss, Mr. Davies, about team morale. He told me, morale is a non-quantifiable metric. Focus on deliverables, Vance. He was wearing earbuds. Not even headphones. Just discreet, flesh-toned buds. I was trying to rationalize it. A new corporate wellness fad focused on deep work. A shared delusion. Mass hysteria. Anything was better than the alternative. But what was the alternative? That a silent, impossible man was creeping down the hallway of my office, and that in response, my colleagues were systematically unplugging themselves from the world, one pair of headphones at a time. The thought was so absurd, so insane, that I would laugh out loud in my empty apartment at night. The sound swallowed by the city's endless hum. The laughter always ended in a shudder. Phase 2, growing awareness and isolation. By mid-November, the man was 60 feet away. I knew this because the number 60 had taken on a talismanic dread. I no longer needed the tape measure, I could feel the distance in my bones. At 60 feet, I could see that his suit was definitely charcoal gray, well-tailored but utterly generic. I could see the slope of his shoulders and the way he held his head, perfectly level. I still couldn't see a face. Where his face should have been was a blur, a smudge of shadow that my eyes couldn't resolve, like a censored photograph. My attempts to find normalcy outside the office became frantic. I'd walk for hours after work, getting lost in the grid of the city, trying to immerse myself in the untidy, chaotic reality of other people. The shouts of street vendors, the hiss of a bus's air brakes, the clamor of a dozen different languages, I drank it all in like a man dying of thirst. But the moment I stepped back on the L train for my morning commute, the feeling of wrongness would descend again. The silence in the elevator was heavier now. The air on the 47th floor felt thinner, charged with a quiet, humming purpose that I was not privy to. My journal became my only confidant. November 15th, distance, 58 feet. I tried checking the security cameras again. I sweet-talked the night guard, a friendly old guy named Gus, into letting me see the feed for the 47th floor corridor. We rewound the footage from the night before. There was me, standing in the hallway, looking at nothing. Just an empty, silent corridor. Gus gave me a look that was 1 part pity, 2 parts concern. Long hours, kid. They get to you. November 18th. The Ethelred account. I'm convinced it's connected. It's the excuse for everything. The overtime, the headphones, the workflow optimization. I looked into the client. Ethelred Incorporated. Their public profile is a ghost. A shell corporation registered in Delaware with no listed officers and no product. Yet, Synoptic has dedicated nearly half our analytical staff to it. The data we're processing for them is strange. Not financial records or logistics. It's raw sensory data. Light frequencies, atmospheric pressure readings, audio files of what sounds like static. November 22nd. I asked Sarah if she wanted to get a drink after work. It was a desperate gambit. A plea. Let's be normal people for an hour. She turned from her screen, her eyes taking a moment to focus on me as if I were a distant object. A post-work social engagement, she asked, the words stilted, academic. That task is not on my current synchronized schedule. It would disrupt my efficiency metrics for tomorrow's deliverables. She then turned back to her screen, the conversation over. I could have been a talking coat rack. I saw her pencil, the one she used to put in her hair, sitting in her pen holder. It was perfectly sharpened, and used. The isolation was no longer a feeling, it was a physical state. I was a foreign body inside a vast, functioning organism. My colleagues moved around me with a frictionless grace that highlighted my own clumsy, unpredictable humanity. They didn't shun me. They simply didn't register me beyond my function as Leo Vance, data analyst. Any attempt at conversation that deviated from the Ethelred project was met with the same placid, disengaging wall of corporate jargon. How was your weekend? I'd ask. The designated non-work period was restful and resulted in optimal preparedness for the current work cycle, someone would reply, without a flicker of irony. My paranoia began to curdle, to seek out patterns everywhere. I started to believe the rhythmic clicking of keyboards was a form of communication, a code I couldn't decipher. The hum of the lights, I was convinced, was not steady. It pulsed, subtly, in a complex rhythm that seemed to sync up with the server room's thrum. I was living inside a machine, and everyone else had learned its language. My last bastion of hope was research. I spent my nights falling down rabbit holes on the internet. I read about architectural hauntings, glitches in the matrix, mimetic hazards. I found forums dedicated to environmental perception shifts and workplace psychological contagions. Most of it was nonsense, conspiracy theories spun by people who saw faces in toast. But it was a comfort to know I wasn't the only person on the planet who thought reality had a loose thread. I found a small, obscure subreddit called r/wrongplaces, dedicated to urban exploration and stories of architectural oddities. People posted about doors that appeared overnight, stairways that led nowhere, rooms that were bigger on the inside. It felt closer to what I was experiencing than anything else. The subplot that kept me sane, my own little project, was digging into the history of the Harrison Plaza building itself. It was built in the late 90s, a gleaming product of the tech boom. I went to the Chicago Public Library's digital archives, scrolling through microfiche of old newspapers. I found what I was looking for in a small article from the Tribune, dated May 1998. Construction mishap at Harrison Plaza site. A structural collapse on one of the upper floors during the final phase of construction. One worker, a man named Thomas Miller, was reported missing, presumed dead, his body never recovered. The article was vague on the details. The official report cited unprecedented gravitational stress. A weird phrase. The incident was quickly buried under headlines about the soaring stock market. There was a grainy photo of the building, a skeletal frame against a gray sky. I stared at it for a long time, trying to see a ghost in its steel bones. Meanwhile, the man in the hall kept advancing. December 1st, distance, 45 feet. Halfway. He is directly under the third light panel from my bay. I can see the knot of his tie now. It is gray, silk, perfectly dimpled. I am afraid to look at his face. I feel like if I see it, I will understand something I don't want to know. December 4th. I tried leaving a box in the middle of the hallway overnight. Just a simple cardboard box for printer paper. I wanted to see if it would impede him. I came in early the next morning. The box was gone. I asked Maria, the morning cleaner. She said she never saw a box. The man was there. He had advanced 3 feet. He had passed through the space where the box had been. He wasn't bound by the physical rules of the world. The realization hit me not with a bang, but with a quiet, sickening certainty. The box, the security footage, his silent approach, it wasn't that people weren't seeing him, it was that he didn't exist in a way that could be seen by them. Or perhaps, they were choosing not to see him. The headphones weren't just blocking out sound, they were filters. They were tuning out the frequency he existed on. And I, for some reason, was unprotected. My work performance plummeted. My reports were late, riddled with errors. My mind was a blizzard of fear and speculation. Eventually, the inevitable happened. I got an email from Mr. Davies' assistant. Mr. Davies requires a meeting to discuss your performance metrics. I walked to his corner office, a glass cage with a panoramic view of Lake Michigan, a vast, indifferent slate of gray water. Davies sat behind a huge mahogany desk. He had his discreet earbuds in. He didn't take them out. "Vance," he said, his voice smooth and detached. "Your recent output has been suboptimal. Your data integration has been asynchronous with the project's core objectives. I've been distracted, sir." "Distraction is an inefficiency," he said, his eyes unfocused, looking somewhere over my left shoulder. "The Ethelred protocol demands total cognitive synergy. Are you not synergized, Vance? The atmosphere here, it's getting to me. The silence. The pressure." Davies tilted his head. "The environment is optimized for productivity. All extraneous variables have been minimized. The system is functioning as designed. It is the component that is failing." He meant me. "You need to realign your priorities. Interface more effectively. Eliminate non-essential mental processes. Or you will become a redundant asset." He swiveled his chair to face the window, a clear dismissal. As I walked out of his office, I felt a cold dread wash over me. He hadn't been talking about my job. It wasn't a threat of being fired. It was a diagnosis. A warning. Get with the program, or be deleted. I walked back to my cubicle, my feet heavy. I looked down the hall. The man was 30 feet away. Close enough now that I could see the texture of his suit jacket, a fine, worsted wool. Close enough that I could see he had hands, clasped loosely in front of him. Close enough that I could see his face was not a blur. It was a void. A perfect, featureless oval of darkness, absorbing all light, all detail, all hope. Phase 3, the nature of the threat and escalation. The fire alarm was the most violent sound I had heard on the 47th floor in months. It was a shrieking, electronic scream that ripped through the placid hum of the office. I flinched, my heart leaping into my throat. But I was the only one. Everyone else simply stopped what they were doing. In perfect unison, they removed their headphones, placed them neatly on their desks, and stood up. There was no panic, no confusion, no shouted instructions. They moved with the silent, programmed purpose of ants whose hill has been disturbed. They formed a single, orderly line that snaked from the cubicle bays towards the emergency stairwell. Sarah passed me, her face serene, her eyes fixed on the back of the person in front of her. She didn't even glance in my direction. Mr. Davies was at the head of the line, his posture impeccable, guiding them like a conductor. I was swept up in the current, my own frantic energy a stark contrast to their eerie calm. The line moved into the stairwell, a concrete chute smelling of dust and cold metal. The sound of their footsteps was uniform, a soft, shuffling cadence. We descended. 47, 46. 45, the fluorescent lights in the stairwell flickered erratically, casting lurching shadows. Then I saw it. Between the landing for the 45th floor and the 44th, there was another door. It was a heavy, steel fire door, painted a faded, sickly green that didn't match the drab gray of the others. A small, stenciled sign next to it read, Floor 44A. My blood ran cold. I stared at the building blueprints for hours in the library. There was no floor 44A. There was no mention of it, no space for it. It was impossible. My co-workers filed past the door without a single glance, their pace unbroken. But my feet had frozen to the concrete. I stared at the impossible door, and then I saw him. He was standing right beside it. The man in the hall. He wasn't a distant silhouette anymore. He was 10 feet away, solid and real in the flickering light. He wasn't looking at me. He was facing the door to floor 44A, his head slightly bowed, as if in reverence or patience. His featureless face was a pit of darkness that seemed to drink the very light from the air. The sight of him, so close, so undeniably present, short-circuited my brain. The fear was so immense it became a kind of clarity. He wasn't a hallucination. He was a destination. And this was the doorway. Someone bumped into me from behind. Maintain procession, a monotone voice said. It was Mark from IT. His eyes were glassy. The line was pushing me forward, forcing me past the green door, away from the man. I craned my neck, trying to keep him in sight. I saw his hand, pale and long-fingered, reach out and rest on the door's handle. Then I was past the landing, being herded down towards the 44th floor. I risked a look back up the stairs. The green door was gone. The man was gone. The wall was a seamless expanse of painted concrete, as if floor 44A had never existed. The flickering in the lights stopped. We exited into the lobby, a silent, orderly crowd, and stood on the plaza outside as fire trucks arrived. It was a false alarm, they said. A sensor malfunction on the 47th floor. As we filed back into the building, I felt a new kind of terror. The incident wasn't just in my head anymore. It was written into the very architecture of the building. And the contagion wasn't just psychological, it was a physical pilgrimage towards whatever lay behind that door. My research became an obsession. The name from the construction accident, Thomas Miller, became my mantra. I found no family, no friends, no further records. He was a ghost in the city's bureaucracy. The phrase from the engineering report, unprecedented gravitational stress, echoed in my mind. It wasn't an engineering term, it was poetry. It was a euphemism for something they couldn't explain. I went back to the r/wrong places subreddit. Armed with the knowledge of floor 44A, I composed a new, desperate post. Title, Phantom Floor in Chicago Loop Skyscraper. Body, has anyone ever heard of a floor appearing and disappearing in a stairwell? Specifically designated with an a suffix, e.g., 44A. Saw something during a fire drill. There was a man standing by the door. He didn't seem normal. Any information on architectural anomalies, non-Euclidean spaces in modern buildings, or similar phenomena would be appreciated. This is not a creative writing exercise. For days, there was nothing. Just the usual comments about carbon monoxide poisoning and urban legends. I was about to give up when a private message appeared in my inbox. The username was just a string of random numbers. The message was short. You saw a janitor. Some places have more floors than they advertise. These are the service levels. The janitors maintain them. They don't like to be noticed. The headphones help you not notice. You stop noticing the janitor, you stop noticing the door. You stay on your floor. It's safer. A janitor. The word chilled me more than ghost or demon. It implied a purpose, a function. He wasn't haunting the 47th floor, he was servicing it. And what was the service? What was the Ethelred account data for? To maintain the illusion of the 47th floor. To power the system. The message continued in a second part. He's not approaching you. He's always been there. Your floor is moving towards him. The whole floor. It's on a track. The Ethelred project is the fuel. Your focus, your energy, it powers the journey. The end of the line is his door. Don't get on the train. I read the message again and again, the words burning themselves into my brain. Your floor is moving towards him. The tape measure, my meticulous documentation of his approach, it was all based on a false premise. I wasn't a stationary observer watching something approach. I was a passenger on a vessel, and the man on the shore was getting larger. The stakes had been rewritten. The contagion wasn't just turning my coworkers into drones, it was feeding something. Their focused, silent, headphone-cocooned work was literally pulling our reality, our little slice of the 47th floor, through some unseen dimension towards the man and his door. This new knowledge made the office unbearable. Every rhythmic keyboard click, every hum of a computer fan, was the sound of the engine. I felt the floor beneath my feet, not as solid concrete and steel, but as a platform, sliding silently through the void. The man was now only 15 feet from my cubicle entrance. I could see the faint pinstripes on his gray suit. I could smell something, a scent that was both sterile like ozone and ancient like dust. The dark void of his face seemed to exert a subtle pressure on the air, a psychic weight that made it hard to breathe. I had to find the person who sent me the message. I replied, my hands shaking. Who are you? How do you know this? Is there a way out? The reply came almost instantly. I was a data analyst. 47th floor. Different company, same building. My floor reached the door 5 years ago. I was the only one who didn't want to get on. I found another way. There's a service elevator. Maintenance shaft 3B, behind the west wall of the server room. It doesn't go up or down. It goes sideways. Be there tonight. Midnight. The door will be open. Don't be late. And don't let the janitor see you leave. A spark of hope, fierce and terrifying. An ally. An escape route. The rest of the day was a fever dream. I pretended to work, my eyes darting between my screen and the silent, dark figure in the hall. He was so close now. I could almost feel the stillness radiating from him, a cold spot in the office's humming atmosphere. As people began to pack up, following their precise, unvarying schedule, I stayed put. Sarah walked past my cubicle. For a fleeting second, I thought I saw a flicker of recognition in her eyes, a ghost of the person she used to be. But it vanished, replaced by the serene, empty focus of the hive. The office emptied out, leaving me alone with the humming lights and the thing in the hall. At 11:55 p.m., I stood up. I didn't look at the man. I walked towards the server room, my heart hammering against my ribs. The server room door was locked, as always. But the message said behind the west wall. I ran my hands along the cool, smooth drywall. In a small alcove, hidden behind a stack of old server manuals, I found it, a faint rectangular outline. A hidden panel. I pressed, and it clicked open, revealing a dark, narrow space. A rush of cool, musty air washed over me. Inside was a small, cage-like elevator, the kind you see in old factories. It was exactly where the message said it would be. Hope surged through me. I was about to step inside when a thought stopped me. A cold, sharp splinter of doubt. It doesn't go up or down. It goes sideways. The message from my anonymous savior. But hadn't I learned anything? My floor wasn't stationary. Sideways from where? And then I heard it. A sound from the main office. A soft, final click. I peered out from the alcove. The man was no longer in the hall. He was standing at the entrance to my cubicle bay, not 10 feet away. And for the first time, he was looking directly at me. The featureless void of his face was fixed on me. And in the absolute darkness of that void, a single point of light flickered, like a distant, dying star. I felt a new message vibrate on the phone in my pocket. I didn't have to look. I knew who it was from. The ally. The survivor. He was the lure. The final part of the system for dealing with redundant assets like me. The service elevator wasn't an escape. It was just another track. Phase 4, Confrontation/Revelation and Aftermath. The choice was not a choice. It was a clarification. Before me, the janitor, the silent terminus, his void face a promise of serene, absolute order. Behind me, the service elevator, a different, unknown track, but a track nonetheless, operated by a liar. Both were cages. My carefully constructed reality had collapsed, leaving only the machinery exposed. The office, the Ethelred account, the headphones, it was all a system designed to harvest focus, to turn human consciousness into fuel to propel this pocket of reality towards an unknown destination. My colleagues weren't victims, they were willing passengers. They had chosen the comfort of the routine, the peace of not having to see the man in the hall. They had put on their headphones and surrendered to the journey. The man took a single, silent step towards me. The air grew thick, heavy with the scent of ozone and dust. The hum of the office deepened, resonating in my teeth. It was the sound of an engine reaching its destination. I looked past him, through my cubicle, at the vast window overlooking the city. Chicago glittered below, a sprawling, complex web of light and life. It seemed a million miles away, a memory of a world that ran on chaotic, unpredictable principles. A world where people had weekends that weren't just designated non-work periods, where they talked about more than deliverables, where they saw each other. Was that world even real? Or was it just another, larger version of the 47th floor, with its own janitors and its own quiet, invisible tracks? The thought was a vertigo-inducing abyss. The janitor raised a hand. It was not a threat. It was an invitation. Join us. Be still. Be silent. The journey is over. The appeal of it was immense, a siren song for my frayed, exhausted mind. No more fear. No more isolation. Just the silent, humming purpose of the system. I could put on the headphones. I could synergize. I could become a part of the whole. But the part of me that had measured the hallway, the part that had scoured library archives, the part that had screamed for help on a forgotten corner of the internet, rebelled. It was a small, stubborn, illogical spark of defiance. It was the part of me that was still human. I turned my back on the janitor and the waiting elevator. I walked away from both false choices. I walked towards the main corridor, towards the emergency stairwell. My heart hammered with a new, wild terror. There was only one door that wasn't part of their system. One door they had shown me by accident. I burst into the stairwell. The air was cold and still. I scrambled up the concrete steps, past the 45th floor, past the 46th. I was praying, a frantic, wordless plea to whatever broken physics governed this place. And then I saw it. The green door. Floor 44A. It was there. I didn't hesitate. I threw myself at it. The handle was cold, solid metal. It turned. The door swung inward with a groan of disused hinges. I stumbled through and the door clicked shut behind me, the sound final and absolute. I was not in an office. I was standing in a hallway. It was identical to the one on the 47th floor. The same invisible gray carpet, the same blank gray walls, the same long, featureless stretch. But it was different. The air was heavy, silent, and utterly cold. There was no hum of servers, no flicker of fluorescent lights. The only illumination was a dim, sourceless twilight that seemed to emanate from the very air itself. I looked down the impossibly long corridor. It stretched into a darkness that my eyes could not penetrate, a darkness that felt infinite. And there, at the very far end of it, 100 feet away, maybe 1,000, stood a figure. A man. Silent. Still. A dark silhouette against the deeper darkness. A wave of vertiginous horror and understanding washed over me. I hadn't escaped. I had simply stepped off one moving platform and onto another. Or perhaps, this was the main line. This was the service level. This was the place the janitors walked. I had left the farm, and now I was in the wilderness where the farmers lived. I took a deep breath of the cold, dead air. My phone was useless here. My knowledge of Chicago, of synoptic data, of everything that had constituted my life, was meaningless. I was Leo Vance, a ghost, a new anomaly in a place made of them. There was nowhere to go but forward. With a strange sense of resignation, a chilling calm that felt terrifyingly similar to the one I'd seen in my coworkers, I took my first step down the silent, endless hall. I didn't know if I was walking towards the man, or if the hallway itself was now moving me. It didn't seem to matter. I had become the man in the hall. And in the profound, waiting silence, I began to walk. The Quiet Contagion, the Glossary Project. Phase 1, the Unsettling Mundane. It began, as all the most insidious endings do, with a word. My name is Elias Thorne, and my world is built of them. For 12 years, I have been a senior copy editor at Clarendon Finch Press, a small, fiercely proud academic publisher nestled in the warm sandstone heart of Oxford. Our office, a narrow 3-story townhouse in Jericho, smells of aging paper, radiator dust, and weak tea. My life is a quiet tapestry of syntax and sense, a daily pilgrimage through the sprawling, beautiful mess of the English language. I correct misplaced modifiers, hunt down errant commas, and ensure that a footnote on 14th-century monasticism is as rigorously cited as a treatise on quantum mechanics. I love the precision. The certainty. The manuscript on my desk was Dr. Eris Thorne's Soil and Sovereignty, Agrarian Economics of the Late Carolingian Period. It was as dry as a ship's biscuit, but I found a certain peace in its dense, factual prose. I was on the final pass, checking the glossary, a task usually delegated to a junior editor but one I perversely enjoyed. It was a final tightening of the screws, ensuring the entire intellectual edifice was sound. Chlorosis, N, a condition in which leaves produce insufficient chlorophyll. Glebe, N, a plot of land serving as part of a clergyman's benefice. Hill, N. A naturally raised area of land, not as high or craggy as a mountain. I stopped. My red pen hovered over the entry for hill. It was a perfectly good word, with a perfectly accurate definition. But what was it doing in a glossary for an academic text? Everyone knew what a hill was. It was like defining sky or water. Superfluous. Patronizing to the reader. I made a note in the margin, query author, delete. Too common for inclusion. I leaned back, stretching my shoulders. Beatrice, whose desk faced mine, glanced up from her screen, a faint, curious smile on her face. Bea was younger than me, sharper in some ways, with a shock of auburn hair she perpetually tucked behind her ear. "Everything all right, Eli?" she asked, her voice a pleasant, low hum against the gentle clatter of keyboards. "Just a strange one," I said, tapping the manuscript. Dr. Thorne's included hill in his glossary. Bea's smile didn't change, but her eyes held a new blankness. It was a subtle shift, like a lens going out of focus. "Hill," she repeated. The word sounded foreign in her mouth, a collection of phonemes devoid of meaning. "Yes. You know, a big lump of earth. We climbed one near Uffington last year for the summer outing." She blinked slowly. "Oh. You mean a topographical elevation?" "Well, yes. A hill. I don't think I know that word," she said, her tone not one of ignorance, but of calm certainty, as if I had just uttered a string of nonsense syllables. Is it a regionalism? She turned back to her screen, the conversation clearly over. A cold pebble of unease dropped into my stomach. It was a joke. It had to be. B had a dry wit. She was teasing me for my pedantry. I forced a chuckle and went back to my work, but the word on the page seemed to shimmer with a new, unwelcome strangeness. Hill. The rest of the day was normal, or I convinced myself it was. But the pebble of unease remained. That evening, walking home under a sky bruised with the promise of rain, I found myself cataloging the words for my surroundings. Pavement. Lamppost. Brick. Slate. They felt solid, dependable. When I looked up at the great, gray billows of water vapor massing overhead, the word that came to mind was cloud. The next day, the word came up in conversation. Gideon, our ferociously ambitious acquisitions editor, was complaining about a digital manuscript submission. It's a mess, he sighed, running a hand through his perfectly coiffed hair. The author hasn't even sorted the files properly. They're just a cloud of documents. A metaphorical cloud, then, I offered, stirring my tea. Not the ones in the sky. Gideon and B both looked at me. This time, Gideon's expression wasn't blank, it was a mask of mild pity, the kind you'd give a rambling great-uncle at a wedding. What are you on about, Elias, he said. The ones in the sky? You mean the atmospheric aerosol layer? You could call it that, I said, my voice tighter than I intended. Or you could call them clouds. That's not a word, B said softly, her gaze flicking to Gideon as if for confirmation. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible shake of his head. It absolutely is, I insisted, my heart starting to thrum against my ribs. I pulled out my phone, my fingers fumbling on the screen. Look. I typed CLOUD into the search bar of the Oxford English Dictionary app, the premium, subscription version the press paid for. The entry loaded. My breath caught in my throat. Cloud, N. 1. A large, abstract collection of digital data accessible via a network. The files were saved to the cloud. 2. Archaic. A state of mental confusion or obscurity. That was it. There was no mention of water vapor, of white puffs against a blue sky. I scrolled down, frantically looking for a secondary definition, historical usage. Nothing. It was as if the sky had been scrubbed from the dictionary. See? Gideon said, with an air of finality. It's for data. But it wasn't, I whispered, staring at my phone. It meant something else. Yesterday. You're probably stressed, mate, Gideon said, clapping me on the shoulder with a dismissive sort of bonhomie. Not getting enough sleep. Sleep. The word hung in the air, and for a terrifying second, I wondered if that one was gone too. But Gideon had used it. It was safe. For now. I spent the rest of the week in a state of low-grade panic, masquerading as diligent focus. I was a frog in a pot of slowly warming water, and I was the only one who could feel the heat rising. I started noticing the subtle erosions in language all around me. People on the bus no longer talked about a bumpy ride, they described negative feedback from the road surface. A couple in a cafe didn't fall in love, they initiated a successful pair bond. The rich, chaotic, beautiful inefficiency of human expression was being shaved away, replaced by something clinical, functional, and sterile. The world was getting quieter, not in volume, but in meaning. The breaking point was Dr. Alastair Finch. The founder and director of our press, a man in his late 70s with a mind like a steel trap and a love for etymology that bordered on the fanatical. He was my last hope. If anyone would recognize the sickness, it would be him. I found him in his office, surrounded by tottering stacks of books that looked as old as the university itself. Alastair, I began, my hands clammy. I need to talk to you about something. Something strange is happening with words. He peered at me over his half-moon glasses. Go on. I told him everything. About hill, about cloud, about the dictionaries, the strange conversations. I spoke with the desperate energy of a man trying to describe the color blue to a world that had gone colorblind. He listened patiently, his fingertips steepled. When I finished, the silence in the room felt immense. Elias, he said, his voice gentle, avuncular. You are our finest editor. Your attention to detail is second to none. But I think perhaps you've been working too hard. The pressure. No, it's not pressure. I said, my voice cracking. Alistair, the word sleep. We know what it means, right? To rest, to dream. A shadow of the same placid confusion I'd seen in Bee crossed his ancient features. It was the most terrifying thing I had ever seen. I'm not familiar with that precise definition, he said slowly. One speaks of requiring a period of metabolic stasis. Sleep, it's a rather vague term, isn't it? Imprecise. We excised it from our new style guide last month. For clarity. He said it with such calm, rational authority that for a horrifying moment, I almost believed him. I felt the ground give way beneath me, the solid bedrock of shared reality turning to sand. I was adrift. Alone. I mumbled an apology and retreated from his office, the scent of old books now seeming like the smell of a tomb. My world of certainty was gone. Language, my sanctuary, had become a house of horrors, its rooms vanishing one by one while everyone else praised the new, open-plan design. That night, I went home and drank half a bottle of whiskey, but the word for what I sought, oblivion, escape, sleep, had lost its power. I just lay in the dark, my mind buzzing, feeling the terrifying weight of a world I could no longer describe. Underscore 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 underscore. Phase 2, Growing Awareness and Isolation. The weeks that followed were a masterclass in gaslighting, with reality itself as the perpetrator. I became a ghost at the press, a silent observer charting the decay. The contagion, for that is what it must be, was accelerating. It wasn't just nouns for natural phenomena. Abstract concepts, words that formed the very bedrock of human experience, began to fray and dissolve. Wonder was one of the next to go. I heard Bee describing a trip to the Pitt Rivers Museum not with awe, but as an efficient cataloging of anthropological artifacts. The concept of being struck by something beautiful or strange had been replaced by a cold assessment of its function. Hope became a projection of positive future outcomes. Sorrow was downgraded to a period of reduced neurochemical efficiency. My colleagues' faces grew smoother, their expressions less nuanced. Their conversations, once peppered with anecdotes and laughter, became transactional exchanges of information. They were becoming more efficient. Their language streamlined for a purpose I couldn't fathom. And I, with my memory of a richer, messier world, was an anomaly. An error in the code. My isolation was absolute. Trying to talk about the changes was like shouting into a vacuum. I'd point out a missing word, and they would look at me with that same placid, unnerving pity. Elias, that's not a word. It never was. Are you feeling all right? My insistence was recast as a symptom of mental decline. My memory became my madness. My salvation, and my damnation, came in a plain white envelope slipped under the door of my flat. There was no stamp, no address, just my name typed in a simple, serif font. Inside was a single piece of heavy cardstock. On it, 5 typewritten words. Keep speaking. Your mind is a lexicon. Protect it. I stared at the note until the letters blurred. A jolt, electric and terrifying, shot through me. I wasn't alone. Someone else knew. Someone else saw the creeping silence. The note wasn't a comfort, it was a commission. A terrible responsibility. Your mind is a lexicon. I was no longer just a victim of the change, I was an archivist of the world that was being erased. That night, I began the glossary project in earnest. I bought a set of thick, leather-bound A5 journals and a fountain pen. I started with the first word I'd lost, hill. Hill, a naturally raised area of land, not as high or craggy as a mountain. From Old English hyll. Often covered in grass or trees. A place for picnics, for rolling down as a child, for gaining perspective. The feeling of tired legs and accomplishment at the summit. The way the wind sounds different at the top. I didn't just write the definition. I wrote the feeling, the context, the poetry of the word. I filled pages with memories, quotes from books I loved, descriptions of paintings. I wrote about the Malvern Hills against a summer sky. I wrote about climbing the small hill behind my grandparents' house. Next, cloud. Cloud, a visible mass of water droplets or ice crystals suspended in the atmosphere. From Old English, clud, mass of rock. Shapes, cumulus, cauliflower, stratus, sheets, cirrus, wisps. They carry rain. They hide the sun and reveal it. To be on cloud 9 is to be euphoric. A cloud on the horizon is a coming trouble. My flat became a sanctuary, a monastic cell dedicated to this sacred, secret work. I filled journal after journal. Sleep, wander, echo, shadow, whisper, dream, mercy, lonely, home. Each entry was an act of defiance, a desperate prayer against the encroaching silence. I spoke the words aloud as I wrote them, my voice a strange sound in the quiet apartment. I was preserving not just words, but worlds. This new purpose gave me a focus, but it also sharpened my paranoia. If someone had sent the note, they could be watching. Or the ones responsible for the change could be watching. The world outside my door felt increasingly alien. I started taking different routes to work, avoiding CCTV cameras, studying the faces of strangers for any flicker of recognition, or hostility. My work at the press became a source of constant, low-level dread. The manuscript for Soil and Sovereignty came back from the author. My query about the word hill had been answered. Dr. Thorne had simply crossed out my note and written beside it in a shaky hand, an unfortunate archaism. Well spotted. Excised. The secondary mystery, the subplot to my own quiet apocalypse, came from that same manuscript. In a dusty corner of the bibliography, I found a citation for a text that felt like a jolt from a cattle prod, Abelard of Cluny, circa 1688. A lexicon of vanishings. Privately printed. A lexicon of vanishings. My heart hammered. I spent a week of evenings in the cavernous, hushed halls of the Bodleian Library, the very heart of the world's collected knowledge. I searched every catalogue, physical and digital. I cross-referenced bibliographies of 17th-century theological and philosophical tracts. Nothing. The book did not exist. There was no record of an Abelard of Cluny. It was a ghost, a bibliographic phantom. Was it a clue, deliberately planted? A red herring from the author? Or was it something more terrifying, a piece of history that had itself been unwritten? A victim of an earlier, similar contagion, with only this single, spectral echo remaining? The thought chilled me to the bone. The quiet had come before. My relationship with B became the most painful casualty of my new awareness. I still felt a deep affection for her, a memory of the easy camaraderie we once shared. One lunchtime, desperate for a connection, I took a risk. I'd printed a photograph I'd taken on that company outing the year before, a beautiful shot of the rolling Berkshire Downs under a sky full of dramatic, billowing clouds. I laid it on her desk. "Do you remember this?" She picked it up. Her eyes scanned the image with a detached, analytical curiosity. "I remember the corporate team-building exercise," she said. "The subsidized lunch was adequate." "No, B, look," I urged, my voice softer than I intended. "Look at the the landscape. The sky. She looked at me, her head tilted. It is a pleasant arrangement of pigments. The undulating topography is statistically interesting. The sky field is variegated. Variegated. That was the word she used. Clinical. Dead. She saw the image, the data points of color and shape, but the concept behind it, the beauty, the majesty of a summer day on an English hill, was gone from her. The word had been the key, and without it, the door to that entire emotional landscape was locked forever. She handed the photo back to me. Your fixation on these semantic anomalies is becoming unproductive, Elias, she said, her voice devoid of malice, full of a strange, sterile concern. You should speak to HR. They have resources for cognitive efficiency. I walked away from her desk, the photograph feeling like a relic from a forgotten civilization. My lexicon wasn't just a collection of words. It was a record of a way of seeing, a way of feeling, a way of being human. And I was its last, lonely librarian. The silence was no longer just around me. It was a vacuum, actively trying to pull the words from my lungs, the memories from my mind. The note had been a warning. I wasn't just protecting a lexicon. I was protecting my own soul. Underscore 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 underscore. Phase 3, the nature of the threat and escalation. The autumn that followed was a season of thinning. The leaves fell from the trees in Oxford's parks, and the words fell from the world. The pattern of loss became clearer, more terrifying. It was a targeted culling. The victims were words of ambiguity, of emotion, of the natural world, of spirituality. Anything that could not be quantified or commodified was being systematically erased from the collective mind. Soul. Grace. Serendipity. Melancholy. Nostalgia. Each loss was a fresh wound. I would hear the absence first, a conversation that felt stilted, a description that was jarringly literal. Then I would confirm it with a quick, sick check of an online dictionary, only to see the entry blank or rewritten into sterile nonsense. Nostalgia, N, a maladaptive fixation on non-current data sets. I began to theorize about the nature of the threat, scribbling frantic notes in the back of my journals. Was it a virus, a mimetic pathogen spreading through language itself? Or was it technological? I started noticing them then, subtle additions to the city's architecture. On the rooftops of the colleges, nestled between ancient spires and gargoyles, were new antennae. They weren't the familiar scaffolding of mobile phone masts. These were slender, black, and jointed at angles that seemed subtly wrong, almost painful to look at, like a line of fractured geometry against the sky. They hummed with a sound that was just at the edge of hearing, a low thrum that felt less like a noise and more like a pressure inside my skull. Was this the source? A broadcast, bathing the city in a signal that slowly, meticulously edited human consciousness? A signal that smoothed out the inconvenient, inefficient wrinkles of the human spirit? The change in people escalated. They weren't just placidly confused anymore, they were becoming actively hostile to what they called imprecise language. It was the new social etiquette, the new morality. To use a lost word was a faux pas, a sign of a disordered mind. One afternoon in the office kitchen, I made the mistake of saying the sunset had been beautiful the evening before. Gideon, who was downloading nutrient paste from the new dispenser that had replaced the coffee machine, actually flinched. Elias, please, he said, his voice sharp with irritation. We do not use such subjective, non-empirical descriptors. If you wish to comment on the atmospheric light scattering phenomena, please specify the wavelength and particulate density. Otherwise, it is just noise. Noise. The word for music, for laughter, for poetry, was now just noise. They were building a new world, a clean, efficient, quiet world, and I was a smudge of dirt on their pristine blueprint. My search for the lexicon of vanishings had become an obsession, my only hope of finding a historical precedent, a weapon, a defense. After weeks of scouring obscure digital archives and the dark corners of the internet, I found it. Not the book itself, but a fragment. A single page, scanned and uploaded to a long-dead forum for linguistic conspiracists. The page was yellowed, the 17th century typeface thick and blurry. But the words were terrifyingly clear. Abelard of Cluny did not describe a contagion or a technology. He wrote of a presence, an entity he called the glossoclast, the word-breaker. It is not a creature of flesh, he wrote, but a principle of unmaking. A great silence that feeds upon the hoard of the world's words. It abhors the vague, the poetical, the divine. It seeks to render man a creature of perfect logic, and thus, a creature of perfect servitude. It thins the world, making it plain for its own inscrutable purpose. It came in my time, and was beaten back by the noise of prayer and the stubborn recitation of tales. But it is patient. It will return. The glossoclast. The word-breaker. The name gave it shape, a form for my terror. It wasn't a random decay, it was a deliberate act. An attack. Emboldened by this horrifying discovery, I decided to seek an ally. The note proved I wasn't alone. I researched retired professors of linguistics and philology at the university, looking for anyone known for eccentric or fringe theories. I found one, Professor Alcuin Albright. He'd been forced into early retirement 20 years ago after publishing a paper on semantic entropy as a precursor to societal collapse. He was perfect. I found him living in a cluttered, dusty flat in Osney, a man with wild white hair and eyes that burned with a fierce, manic intelligence. The place smelled of pipe tobacco and decaying books. I felt, for the first time in months, a flicker of something I could no longer name, a projection of positive future outcomes. Hope. They called me a crank, he rasped, after I'd poured out my story, showing him my journals. He grabbed one, his gnarled fingers tracing the words as if they were holy relics. Semantic decay. The hollowing out of the signifier. I warned them. It's a predator that hunts in the noosphere, the realm of human thought. It starves us of meaning until we are simple enough to be controlled. We talked for hours. He knew about the antennae, calling them semantic resonance tuners. He theorized that the glossoclast was an extra-dimensional intelligence, or perhaps an AI from a future that had pruned its own past. For the first time, I was not explaining, but collaborating. I was not mad. I was a witness. Your lexicon, he said, his eyes gleaming. It's more than an archive, my boy. It's a shield. A weapon. Every time you speak these words, every time you write them, you are reinforcing reality. You are fighting back. Keep it safe. Keep speaking. I left his flat feeling lighter than I had in a year. I had an ally. There was a resistance, even if it was just two men in a dusty corner of Oxford. I went back the next day, bringing a fresh journal and a bottle of good single malt. I knocked on his door, a smile on my face. The door was opened by a man in a crisp gray suit. Behind him, two other similarly dressed individuals were wiping down surfaces with antiseptic cloths. The flat was almost empty. The books were gone. The clutter was gone. The smell of tobacco was gone, replaced by the sterile tang of bleach. Professor Albright was sitting in a single chair in the middle of the room. He was neat, his wild hair combed flat. He wore a simple, gray tunic. He looked up at me, and his eyes, once burning with fierce light, were calm. Placid. Empty. Ah, Elias, he said, his voice a monotone. Thank you for coming. These gentlemen are from the Ministry of Linguistic Hygiene. They have been helping me declutter. My blood ran cold. Professor. I whispered. He gestured to the journal in my hand. I have explained to them about your project, he said. A fascinating catalogue of redundant terminology and semantic errors. A case study in cognitive inefficiency. They are very interested in helping you streamline it. The man in the suit smiled, a thin, lipless expression. We believe in a clean mental workspace, Mr. Thorne. It improves productivity. We can help you. He took a step towards me. I took a step back. Albright, my ally, my hope, had been assimilated. He hadn't just succumbed, he had become a collaborator. The resistance was not two men. It was one. And they knew his name. They knew my name. I turned and fled. I didn't look back. I ran through the streets of Osney, the sound of my own ragged breath loud in my ears. The low hum from the rooftop seemed to intensify, a triumphant, mocking thrum that vibrated in my teeth. The glossoclast wasn't just erasing words. It was hunting the people who remembered them. Underscore 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 underscore. Phase 4, Confrontation/Revelation and Aftermath. My flight from Albright's flat was a descent into a new level of reality. The glossoclast, or its human agents at the Ministry of Linguistic Hygiene, now knew who I was and what I was doing. The quiet contagion was no longer passive. It had become personal. The world began to actively glitch around me. It was as if my presence, my mind full of forbidden words, was a rock in the stream of their new reality, causing ripples of error. The digital clock on a bus stop would flicker, showing impossible times like 25:73. The lettering on a street sign for High Street would momentarily dissolve into a cascade of binary code before resolving back into place. Walking past a row of parked cars, I saw my reflection in their windows not as a man, but as a shimmering column of static, a ghost of corrupted data. The hum of the city had changed. It was deeper now, more pervasive. It felt like the engine of the world was being retuned, and I was the grinding gear that was about to be stripped. I holed up in my flat, the curtains drawn, my lexicon journal stacked around me like a fortress. But I knew I couldn't stay. They would come for me. The confrontation, when it came, was not one of violence, but of insidious, gentle concern. It happened at the press. I had gone in early one morning, a desperate, foolish attempt to retrieve some personal files from my computer. I found them waiting for me in my office, Alastair, B, and Gideon. They were not threatening. They were smiling. It was the calm, placid smile of a care worker approaching a disturbed patient. The air in the room was thick with their collective certainty. On my desk, laid open, was one of my journals. My lexicon. Elias, Alastair began, his voice the epitome of paternal reason. We were worried when you didn't come in. We let ourselves into your flat to ensure your well-being. And we found these. He gestured to the journal. This, project of yours. It's a monumental undertaking, he said, and for a wild second I thought he understood. But then he continued, and it is monumentally inefficient. Redundant. Full of conceptual noise. It's a sickness, Eli, B said, her voice soft and persuasive. The affection in it was a phantom limb, a memory of a feeling she could no longer access. This clinging to obsolete data. It's making you unhappy. It's making you unclear. We can help you. Gideon picked up the journal. Look at this entry. Hope, he read. A slight sneer on his face. A feeling of expectation and desire for a certain thing to happen. So vague. So unquantifiable. We have a better system now, Elias. A cleaner one. We can integrate you. We can help you delete the corrupt files. They weren't going to hurt me. They were going to edit me. They wanted to strip my mind, to wipe the slate clean, to cure me of my memories. They saw my soul as a bug in the system, and they were the benevolent exterminators. This was the true horror, not a boot stamping on a human face, but a gentle, smiling hand wiping it clean of all expression. This was a fight I could not win. It was a choice. I could stay and let them streamline me into their quiet, gray world, or I could run and become a ghost, a keeper of words no one else would ever understand. I looked at their faces, Alistair's calm authority, Gideon's smug certainty, Bea's empty concern. I saw the faces of the future. My lexicon. Your mind is a lexicon. Protect it. In that moment, I chose. I didn't say a word. I grabbed the journal from Gideon's hand, shoved past B, and bolted for the door. Their calls followed me down the stairs, not angry, but disappointed, like teachers scolding a truant. Elias, this is an illogical course of action. Your probability of positive outcome is decreasing. I fled Oxford, the city of spires and whispers, leaving my life behind like a shed skin. I took only a backpack with the clothes I was wearing, my wallet, and my fortress of journals. I took a train north, as far as it would go, away from the cities, away from the hum of the antennae, away from the clean, quiet people. I was heading for a place defined by the very words they had erased. I was heading for the Scottish Highlands. I am writing this now in a small, rented crofter's cottage overlooking a loch whose name I dare not write down, lest the simple act of recording it flags it for erasure. I am surrounded by hills, mist, and a silence that is deep and ancient, not hollow and new. I spend my days writing, walking, and speaking. I am the last priest of a dead religion. I recite my lexicon to the wind and the water. I tell the story of a girl's laughter to the stoic, gray sheep. I describe the feeling of sorrow to the rain-lashed mountains. I whisper the meaning of love to the dying embers in my hearth. I am a lonely, mad king ruling an empire of ghosts. I have saved the words. But I am beginning to fear I have not saved myself. The contagion, I realize now, is not just external. It's not just a broadcast. It's a principle of reality, a tide of entropy that pulls at everything, including me. The note was right. My mind is a lexicon. But even lexicons get worn. The pages fade. This evening, I watched the sun set over the loch. The water became a sheet of molten gold, the sky a breathtaking tapestry of purple, pink, and orange. It was a perfect, aching moment of beauty. I opened my journal to try and capture it. I wrote the words, majesty, splendor, glorious, wonder. But as I formed the letters, a new kind of chill crept over me, a cold that had nothing to do with the Highland air. The words felt thin. Like definitions I had memorized but no longer understood. I could remember the meaning of beauty, but I couldn't feel its warmth in my chest. The connection between the word and the world, the signifier and the signified, was fraying, even here, even within me. I look at the word I have just written on the page, the name for what I once believed would be my salvation. Hope. It feels strange on my tongue. A foreign sound. An echo in an empty room. The quiet is not just in the world anymore. It's in me. And it is growing.